Welcome, dear listener, to this cozy corner of history. As the day's troubles melt away and the night draws her starry cloak around you, let me paint you a picture of a distant time and place. A land of rugged beauty, where the skirl of bagpipes echoes through glens and the mists roll in from the lochs. A land of hardy people, tested by the crucible of bitter cold. This is the Scotland of the Middle Ages, and tonight we'll explore why its winters were so very brutal. But first, I'd love to know who I have the pleasure of speaking to this evening. Where in the world are you nestled right now, listening to these words? What time is it in your corner of the globe? Are you winding down after a long day, or perhaps just starting a new one? Wherever and whenever you are, I'm honoured to have you here. If you enjoy embarking on soothing journeys through history like this, I warmly invite you to subscribe so we can meet again. Now, make yourself comfortable, dear friend. Wrap yourself in a quilt of serenity and let the distractions of the day slip away like autumn leaves on the wind. Imagine you are a traveller, stepping through the portal of time to a distant age. The modern world falls away and you find yourself standing on a lonely moor, with the first snowflakes of winter kissing your cheeks. Ahead in the gathering dusk, you see the warm glow of firelight flickering in the windows of a stone tower. The sound of revelry and music drifts out to greet you. You are in medieval Scotland, on the eve of a winter both majestic and merciless. As you approach the keep, you feel the weight of hundreds of Scottish winters stretching back through the centuries. Winters that were part and parcel of this land's untamable spirit. Winters that brought breathtaking, pristine beauty, but also hardship, hunger, and bone-chilling cold that hold a fierce place in the Scottish story. What was it that made Scotland's medieval winters such a brutal, defining force? Like the complex tartans of her famous clans, it was woven of many strands. Her northerly location, her wild terrain, the long reach of the Little Ice Age, and the hard-scrabble lives eked out by most of her people. The makings of a perfect storm that swirled through the Middle Ages. But this is no bleak tale of woe. It's also a testament to Scottish resilience, to the strength of spirit that carried them through the darkest depths of winter. So blow on your frozen fingers and huddle a bit closer to the peat fire as it pops and crackles merrily. Let the winds of time blow away your cares as we explore what winter meant in medieval Scotland, how her people lived, worked, celebrated, and suffered through the icy months. We'll meet kings and commoners, journey through snowbound landscapes, and perhaps find that in the harshest times, the warmth of the human spirit shines brightest. But for our tale to begin, we must first set the stage. And the backdrop to Scotland's winter drama was her dramatic landscape and moody climate. Rugged mountains reared up to snag passing clouds. Mist-shrouded forests and glens seemed to hold secrets from another age. Powerful rivers and waterfalls surged, fueled by rain and snowmelt. And along her thousands of miles of wind-swept coast, the surf pounded and roared. It was these very features of Scotland's terrain that conspired with her northerly latitude to brew up winters of legendary ferocity. With much of the land lying north of the 55th parallel, Scotland was on the same chilly plain as Alaska and Siberia. The Highland Mountains, some reaching over 4,000 feet, sieved the cold winds and provided an icy scaffold for the snows to pile high. The frigid waters surrounding Scotland also played a starring role, with the meeting of cold and warm currents churning up turbulent weather. But the people of medieval Scotland weren't just at the mercy of an unkind geography. The very climate of the times was shifting. The centuries we'll be exploring, from roughly the 1200s through the 1600s, were smack in the middle of a climatic complication known as the Little Ice Age. A period when, for complex reasons still being unravelled, global temperatures took a downward dip and the mercury rarely rose above freezing in winter. This brought harsher weather woes to all of Europe, But Scotland, already teetering on the frigid brink, really felt the freeze. Imagine the scene as winter tightened its grip on the Scottish landscape. A blanket of white smothering the hills and fields. Icicles glinting like crystal daggers from the eaves. Breath billowing in frosty plumes, and fingers numb with cold. The howling gales bearing down from the highlands, scouring the glens with an icy blast. Shivering livestock huddling together for warmth. Nights so cold, the very stars seemed to tremble in the inky sky. This was no mere seasonal inconvenience. It was a full-scale assault by General Winter himself. An assault that could last for long, merciless months, with some of the worst winters dragging on into April or even May. The Great Winter of 1434 was one for the record books, with even mighty rivers like the Thames frozen solid. That winter, it was said the birds fell dead from the sky, and ale froze solid in the casks. Into this teeth-chattering scene, let's place the hardy people of medieval Scotland. For them, winter wasn't just a time to hunker down with a mug of mulled wine. It was a foe to be reckoned with, an icy gauntlet thrown down by Mother Nature herself. The challenges they faced in their winter war were many, from just staying warm to putting food on the table. Imagine being a common crofter, living in a humble stone cottage with a roof of thatch. The walls might be insulated with turf or heather, but the chill seeped in like an unwelcome guest. Your only heat comes from a small central hearth, the peat fire filling the air with its pungent, earthy smoke. At night, you'd heap the precious coals and pray they'd still be glowing come dawn. Feeding the fire was an endless task, with whole days devoted to cutting and drying peat from the bogs during summer. If you ran out of fuel in winter, you might be reduced to burning dried dung or precious furniture. Frostbite was a constant spectre, a reminder of winter's bite. It was no easier in the grand castles and keeps of the nobility. Though grander in scale, with huge fireplaces and elaborate tapestries adorning the walls, the chill still crept in through the cracks. The great halls were warmed only by the press of bodies and the heat of hundreds of candles. Even the grandest lord might wake to find his bedchamber dusted with snow and his wash basin frozen solid. But staying warm was only half the battle. There was the constant question of keeping bellies full as well. In a time when most folk lived hand to mouth, winter was the lean time. The grain harvested in autumn had to stretch through the cold months, supplemented by whatever salted meat, dried fish, and hoarded root vegetables you'd managed to lay by. But winter was an unforgiving taskmaster, and stores often ran thin. Livestock, already scrawny from the meagre winter fodder, might die off, robbing a family of precious milk, meat and wool. Game was scarce, the deer and boar gone to ground. Rivers and lakes might freeze, cutting off the option of fishing. In the winter of 1439, the scarcity was so dire it led to widespread famine. It was said that men dropped dead in the streets, their lips stained green from eating grass in desperation. Of course, not everyone suffered equally in the icy grip of a Scottish winter. While the common folk shivered and scraped by, the nobility had resources and reserves to tap. Their game parks might still yield a haunch of venison for the table. Their granaries were full of wheat, barley and oats paid as rent by their tenants. But even they weren't immune to winter's wrath. The tale is told of how King James I nearly met his death in the winter of 1424. Returning from his long imprisonment in England, his ship was caught in a ferocious winter storm off the Scottish coast. Towering waves and howling winds nearly dashed them on the rocks. The king, it's said, made a desperate vow to the Virgin Mary, promising to dedicate his life to virtue if only he survived. A vow he reportedly kept, though perhaps more in letter than in spirit. But how did one dress for a winter that could freeze the very marrow in your bones? Layering was key, and even the humblest soul aimed for a linen shirt, woolen tunic, and cloak if they could come by them. Tough, weathered hides were made into boots, if you were lucky enough to have them. The nobility, of course, turned winter wear into an art form, with sumptuous furs, rich velvets, and voluminous cloaks as much a display of wealth as a bid for warmth. But no matter how fine your garb, the chill had a way of seeping through. And so the people of medieval Scotland got creative in their quest for warmth. A hot stone plucked from the hearth and wrapped in cloth might warm a bed. Cuddling was certainly encouraged, with whole families often sharing a single bed for heat. Even the livestock might be invited inside to share their body warmth, though they came with their own pungent aroma. Hearty food and drink were also key to staving off the chill. A steaming bowl of pottage, thick with barley and whatever vegetables could be had, filled the belly and thawed the bones. Ales, meads, and the fiery whisky beatha, the water of life that would become whiskey, weren't just a pleasure, but a crucial source of sustaining calories. The winter festivals, chief among them Christmas and Hogmanay at the New Year, were a welcome chance to feast, wassail, and forget the cold for a spell. Boar's head and haggis were served forth in castles, while humbler tables might see a precious bit of hoarded dried fruit or a honey cake. The Yule log burned merrily in the hearth, a symbol of light's triumph over the dark of midwinter. But as any soul who's endured a frigid night can attest, winter has a way of seeping into the bones and the spirit alike. Medieval medicine, a mix of herbal lore, superstition, and religious belief, often fell short in the face of winter's ravages. Frostbite and hypothermia were grim realities, and respiratory ailments ran rampant in the smoke-filled, ill-ventilated crofts and castles. The winter chill seemed to invite dark spirits as well. Pagan traditions still held sway, with many a Scot leaving offerings for the fairies, and spirits thought to roam the long nights. The winter solstice was a time of omens and auguries, when a glimpse of one's future might be caught in a frozen pool under the moon. Even the pious might wonder if the unrelenting cold was a sign of divine disfavour. When King Charles I chose the dead of winter for his Scottish coronation in 1625, many saw it as an ill omen. The new king shivered his way through the ceremony, his teeth chattering audibly as the crown was placed on his head. It was a grim portent for a reign that would end in disaster and dissolution. But perhaps the cruelest cut of a Scottish winter was how it could isolate and immobilise. Roads that were little more than muddy tracks in summer became impassable, buried under snowdrifts. Travel was a perilous proposition, with many a traveller lost to the white wilderness. Trade ground to a halt, leaving communities to survive on their own meagre resources. The story of Margaret, the young Norwegian princess, who was to wed the Scottish king in 1286, illustrates the hazards vividly. Setting out in autumn to claim her throne, her ship was driven by storms to the Orkney Islands. There, stranded by the fierce winter weather, the delicate young bride-to-be fell ill and breathed her last, throwing the very succession of Scotland into turmoil. Even warfare, that constant drumbeat of the Middle Ages, was forced to bow before winter's might. Armies found themselves bogged down, their supply lines stretched thin. The English king Edward I learned this lesson the hard way during his winter siege of Stirling Castle in 1304. His troops, ill-equipped for the brutal cold, began to desert in droves. Many froze to death in the frigid mires surrounding the castle walls. But through all the tales of winter's cruelty runs a thread of Scottish resilience as bright and strong as any clan tartan. The very hardship of winter seemed to breed a toughness, a stern refusal to yield in the face of adversity. Perhaps it was the knowledge that spring would come again, no matter how dark the winter night. You can see it in the tenacity of William Wallace's ragged troops, shivering in their plaids as they harried the English invaders. In the stubborn stone walls of the crofts and castles that stand to this day, having weathered 1,000 winters. In the unquenchable spark of celebration that kindled the Yuletide fires and hogmanay toasts, defying the dark and cold. And so, even as we shiver at the thought of those long-ago winters, we can marvel at the strength of the Scottish spirit that endured them. As we nestle deeper into our own warm beds, perhaps we can spare a grateful thought for those hardy souls of the Middle Ages. They faced the worst that winter could throw at them, year after year, with a grit and grace that speaks across the centuries. So let the wild winter winds blow outside your window tonight, dear listener. Let the frost trace its delicate patterns on the pane, and let your dreams carry you back to a distant Scotland, where the fires burned bright against the deep midwinter dark, where the land and its people were tested by ice and storm, and forged into something strong and true. And maybe, just maybe, as you drift off to sleep, you'll catch a snippet of an ancient song on the night breeze, a song of warm peat fires and cold starry skies, of feasting and famine, of winter's cruelty and the unquenchable warmth of the human heart, a song to carry you through the longest night, whispering of spring's sweet promise to come. Good night, my friend, and fair dreams to you. May your winter nights be warm and bright, and your spirit as strong as any Scottish soul. And may the tale of Scotland's brutal winters remind us all of the resilience that dwells within, no matter how fierce the storm. The frozen crust of snow crunched underfoot, piercing the bone-chilling stillness of that December night. Though wrapped in thick woolen plaids, the weary travellers felt winter's icy fingers reaching through, numbing fingers and toes, seeping into their very bones. It was 1392, and they still had miles to go before reaching shelter, if indeed any could be found on a night like this. They were far from the first to find themselves at the mercy of a cruel Scottish winter. For centuries, the people of this rugged northern land had endured some of the harshest winter conditions imaginable. In a time before modern heating, weather forecasting, or snow ploughs, winter in medieval Scotland was a brutal, inescapable fact of life. It wasn't just the cold itself, though temperatures routinely plunged below freezing, nor was it solely the deep snows that blanketed the glens and moors, sometimes accumulating to heights taller than a man. No, what made winters so ferocious in those days was the all-consuming nature of it. The cold seeped into every crack and crevice, chilling stone castle walls and humble peasant cottages alike. The snows cut off roads and passes, isolating entire villages for months. Food stocks dwindled, sicknesses raged, and the spectre of death loomed large. The Scottish winter was an untamable beast that ruled the land utterly. To understand the full extent of winter's dominion over medieval Scotland, we must first examine the very land and climate itself. Scotland is a far northern country, its northernmost islands brushing up against the Arctic Circle. Much of its landmass is mountainous or comprised of windswept moors, offering scant protection from the elements. Winters are long, with the sun slouching low across the sky for a scant 7 hours, even in the southern lowlands. But it wasn't always quite as fierce as the deepest winters of the medieval period. The 14th century marked the beginning of a climatic phenomenon known as the Little Ice Age, which would last for hundreds of years. It brought an onset of colder average temperatures that hit Scotland particularly hard. Chroniclers of the time document a notable increase in snowfall, ice, and storminess that coincided with this shift. Successive generations came to know a Scotland even more frigid and inhospitable than what came before. The winter of 1434 stood out as especially brutal, even to a populace accustomed to harsh conditions. That season's unrelenting blizzards and ice storms ravaged the land for months, choking roads, freezing rivers solid, and burying fields and pastures under several feet of snow. Even the salt sea locks were rimmed with ice, bringing trade and fishing to a standstill. Thousands of cattle and sheep froze to death in the fields, their carcasses often remaining entombed in snow until spring. Many commoners also perished from cold, hunger, or sickness that stalked the land. It was a winter seared into memory and passed into legend as one of the worst in a long lineage of Scottish winters. So what was it like to face such deep winters year after year? For the vast majority, daily life in the winter months was a constant battle of survival fought within the walls of their own home. Most commoners lived in crude stone cottages or sod-roofed black houses, many with only a beaten earth floor. Even the castles and tower houses of clan chiefs and minor nobles offered little respite, their cavernous stone halls and draughty passageways sapping heat as quickly as the giant hearths could replenish it. Keeping warm itself was an all-consuming affair. The peat or wood that fueled the central hearth was often in scarce supply, necessitating expeditions out into the teeth of snowstorms to gather more fuel. Most could scarcely afford to keep the fire burning through the night, meaning rising in the pre-dawn gloom to a home scarcely warmer than the frigid outdoors. Fingers grew chapped and raw from constant exposure. Toes tingled and ached inside sodden, icy boots. The cold found its way inside the body to linger for months, an unwelcome companion worn like a hair shirt. For peasants, winter also brought a constant, gnawing hunger. Their humble stores of grains, salted meats, and hard cheese had to stretch until spring, supplemented by whatever slim pickings could be gathered from the frozen landscape. Hares and other small game were stiff with cold, their tracks easily spotted and followed across the snowy hills. Fish could sometimes be pulled from holes cut in the ice of rivers and lochs. Coastal dwellers might scour the cold sands for mussels and cockles, but it was never quite enough. As the long winter wore on, belts cinched ever tighter, and ragged garments hung ever looser on shrunken frames. The spectre of outright famine was never far away in those precarious months. The winter of 1439 saw a convergence of icy storms and meagre harvest that plunged entire swathes of the country into destitution. Thousands starved to death outright, while countless others were left sickly and weakened. In desperation, some resorted to eating the tough, stringy meat of their draft animals, or even the shrunken, blackened roots, clawed from fields buried in feet of snow. It was a quiet apocalypse that decimated entire communities and permanently scarred the psyches of survivors. Of course, the nobility were not immune from winter's ravages, even if their larders were better stocked. They too woke to ice glistening on the insides of windows and breath frosting before their faces. In their grand halls, tapestries rippled in the draughts, and jeweled fingers grew stiff and clumsy. But their fuller bellies and heaping hearths stoked resentment among those who struggled in the shadows of castle walls. It was yet another way the long winter widened the gulf between commoner and noble. Even a king might be humbled before winter's might. As the story goes, King James I was travelling in the Highlands one frigid January when a sudden blizzard forced him to seek shelter in a crude bothy, or peasant's hut. That night, as the wind howled and the king shivered beneath a heap of smoky plaids, he tasted for himself the bitter harshness of his subjects' winter plight. Though he survived the night, the image of the great king brought so low would endure. So how did Scots, both high and low, seek to keep winter's killing cold at bay? The most basic defense was simply clothing. Layer upon layer of rough-spun wool and shaggy hides. A commoner might wear a sark and woolen trewies beneath a heavy plaid, topping it off with a hood and shaggy sheepskin boots stuffed with straw. A noblewoman swaddled herself in velvets and furs, ermine for the luckiest few, rabbit and fox for the rest. Certain garments took on an almost talismanic quality in the depths of winter. The fisherman's Guernsey sweater, knitted so tightly it was said to be nearly waterproof, or the great kilt, so voluminous a man could wrap himself in it like a blanket as he slept by the dying fire. Nearly as vital as the hearth for staving off the cold inside the home were the thick hangings that covered chilly stone walls. Tapestries, for those who could afford them, or simpler woolen hangings trapped precious heat while blocking drafts. The grandest castles hung their walls in layer after layer of rich fabrics, creating pockets of still, warmer air. Warming the bed was its own unique challenge. Those of some means used bronze or stone bed-warming pans, filled with embers to heat the sheets before slipping between them. Others relied on the body heat of companion to keep warm through the long nights, whether human or animal. It wasn't uncommon for peasants to bring livestock inside to sleep alongside them on the coldest nights, the heat of a placid cow or shaggy hound helping to fend off frostbite. Some swore by the practice of placing smooth stones in the hearth until they were piping hot, then wrapping them in bits of old cloth and tucking them into bed like a hot water bottle. Of course, more than a few unwary sleepers were scorched or branded by a stone that was a touch too toasty, but it was considered well worth the risk. While it seems hard to believe from the vantage point of our modern, centrally heated world, alcoholic beverages were also seen as an essential winter warmer in medieval Scotland. Ale, whiskey, and mead provided precious calories, helped numb the ever-present chill, and offered vital escape from the bleakness of those long, dark months. Drink flowed most freely during the winter holidays of Christmas and Hogmanay, which were cherished chances for revelry and abundance in the leanest season. A Christmas feast in a great medieval Scottish hall would have been a sight to behold. Trestle tables groaning with plates of roasted goose and venison, minced pies, plum porridge, and mountains of oatcakes. Hogsheads of ale were breached, goblets of claret and sack raised in boisterous toasts. For a few precious days, the cold and dark seemed held at bay by the light of the Yule log and the camaraderie of kith and kin. But once the holidays were past, the realities of winter closed in once more. Travel became difficult and dangerous as roads drifted over and ice slicked the stones. Messengers shivered their way across the landscape on horseback, breath crystallizing in the frigid air. Important missives were delayed by weeks as the couriers battled blinding snow squalls and life-threatening cold. Carts and carriages were generally abandoned until the spring thaw, meaning vital supplies might be cut off. The impact on trade could be devastating, as merchant ships found themselves iced into port and overland routes became treacherous. The royal court itself often ground to a halt, as nobles from far-flung regions struggled to make the arduous winter journey to the capital. The consequences for fragile medieval governance were very real. No one understood those consequences better than the poor, luckless child Queen Margaret, the Maid of Norway. Only 7 years old, she was the heir to the Scottish throne and future bride of King Edward I's son. In the fall of 1290, she set out from Norway to claim her inheritance, only to perish in the icy waters of the North Sea when her ship was blown off course and wrecked in the Orkney Islands. The ensuing succession crisis would eventually lead to England's invasion and a disastrous war. The lonely, frigid death of a little girl had changed the course of nations. Such was the outsized power of a Scottish winter. Winter's icy grip didn't stop armies from marching and wars from being waged, but it did make them exponentially more miserable and costly. In an era of swords and horse-mounted knights, deep snows and bone-chilling cold favoured defenders over attackers. Armies struggled to find forage for themselves and their horses in the bleak winter landscape. Many a campaign stalled out or met disaster amid the drifts and frozen stream crossings. Perhaps no military campaign captures the brutal futility of winter warfare in Scotland better than the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304. That year, a mighty English army under King Edward I arrived at the castle gates in April, only to find their efforts frustrated by the 30 Scottish defenders hurling rocks, arrows, and pots of boiling oil from atop the battlements. As the weeks dragged on and supplies ran low, the English faced a Scottish adversary even more daunting than the tenacious garrison, the onslaught of winter. By the time the castle finally fell in July, Edward's army had been ravaged by exposure, disease, and desertion brought on by spending months camped in the shadow of the snow-capped Ochil Hills. It was a Pyrrhic victory that left the English forces a shadow of their former selves. Winter's impact on warfare could be felt at the strategic level as well. In 1306, Robert the Bruce and his hardscrabble army faced a long winter on the run in the Western Highlands, hounded by pro-English Scottish enemies, and struggling to find food and shelter amid the ice and snow. Bruce's men survived by foraging the scant winter landscape and launching lightning raids, only to disappear back into the wooded glens. It was a mobile sort of warfare well suited to the season, as opposed to set-piece battles and castle sieges. By the time spring arrived, they had not only survived, but gained enough strength to begin turning the tide against the English. Winter had proven the anvil upon which a war-winning strategy was forged. But the season was an indifferent killer, culling Scot and invader alike. William Wallace, national hero of the First War of Scottish Independence, saw his army decimated not by English swords, but by an outbreak of dysentery during the winter of 1298. After a string of stunning victories against the English that culminated in triumph at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace and his men found themselves languishing in pestilent winter camps with scarce food and inadequate shelter. Weakened by cold and hunger, racked by uncontrollable bouts of bloody diarrhea, thousands of Scottish fighters wasted away ingloriously amid the snowdrifts. It was an ignoble end for an army of heroes, highlighting winter's merciless levelling effect. Of course, the omnipresent cold, hunger, and sickness of winter hit civilian populations hardest of all. Medieval medicine in Scotland was ill-equipped to handle the array of seasonal afflictions. The humoral theory of disease that guided treatments focused on restoring balance between the four bodily fluids, or humours: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. In winter, it was believed that an excess of cold, wet phlegm in the body caused respiratory ailments like pneumonia and bronchitis. Monks and herbalist healers concocted medicinal syrups and potions using winter-available ingredients like juniper berries, angelica root, and pine resin to help expel the noxious phlegm. Patients might be bled with leeches to reduce fever and inflammation. Poultices of mustard and garlic were applied to the chest to warm the lungs and loosen congestion. Unsurprisingly, these haphazard treatments did little to stem the tide of winter mortality. For frostbite and chilblains, perhaps the most ubiquitous of cold weather ailments, the treatments often did more harm than good. Texts like Bald's Leech Book advised soaking affected areas in a mixture of onion, salt, and urine. Others swore by repeatedly plunging frozen extremities in buckets of icy water, or vigorously rubbing them with handfuls of snow. More than a few sufferers of severe frostbite found themselves under the knife of a surgeon's amputation saw. It's hard to overstate the deadly toll that 8 or more months of frigid weakening conditions had on medieval Scots, especially the very young, old, and infirm. Estimates suggest that in an average winter, 10% of the population might perish from cold, disease, or malnutrition, a death rate that could easily double during times of extreme cold or famine. Surviving infancy was an especially dicey proposition. Swaddled babes succumbed quietly in the night, lungs stilled by icy, illness-choked air. Mothers wept frozen tears over small, wasted bodies. And yet, despite winter's legion cruelties, there was a certain grim pride taken in the ability to survive it year after brutal year. A uniquely Scottish hardiness and resilience was forged in the crucible of those unending winters, the same stoic intractability that would one day lead to the Scots flinging off the yoke of English overlordship for good. Winter had chiselled the character of a nation. It had also chiselled the stones of medieval Scotland's holiest places. The great cathedrals and abbeys that rose in the depths of winter were solemn triumphs of hope and faith over nature's cruelty. Monks labouring by candlelight transcribed religious texts and tomes of learning with half-frozen fingers. Architects drew up ever more soaring designs for stained glass windows and flying buttresses, defying winter's dominion with feats of God-glorifying grandeur. The pious faithful shuffled through knee-high drifts to huddle together at Mass, praying for spring's merciful arrival. But even as the church fought to keep hearts and minds focused on higher things, the old pagan ways still held sway in the depths of winter. The Yule season, ostensibly celebrating the birth of Christ, carried echoes of more ancient rites. Scots bedecked their halls with holly and ivy, burned Yule logs, and held wild masked processions, all hearkening back to a time when winter was ruled by capricious spirits needing to be appeased. Hogmanay, the Scottish New Year's celebration, was an especially liminal time rife with superstitions and folk magic. Lumps of coal were exchanged as talismans of warmth and plenty for the coming months. The direction of the wind as the clock struck midnight was carefully noted as a portent of the year ahead. First footing, or ensuring the right sort of visitor was first across a home's threshold after midnight, was believed to set the household's fortune until spring arrived. In remote corners of the Highlands and Islands, darker, older rites persisted. Broken shards of pottery were arranged on doorsteps and window ledges to snare malevolent winter fairies. Charms of rowan and red thread were hung from cattle stalls and bedposts. Those who fell afoul of witches or, as the Little Ice Age tightened its icy grip on Scotland, the difficulties of winter travel only worsened. Snowbound roads and treacherous conditions made even short journeys an ordeal. Fierce blizzards could bury entire villages, cutting them off from the outside world for weeks or even months at a time. The howling winds and deep snowdrifts turned familiar landscapes into alien, unrecognizable vistas. For merchants and traders, the winter months meant a significant slowdown in business. Markets and fairs that usually bustled with activity stood empty and forlorn. Ships remained moored in icy harbours, their crews huddled below decks for warmth. The great overland trade routes that connected Scotland with England and the continent fell silent, the only sound the eerie whistle of the wind over the frozen ground. This isolation could have profound consequences, especially in times of crisis. In the winter of 1289, Scotland was plunged into a constitutional crisis with the untimely death of the young Queen Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway. Only 7 years old, Margaret was the last remaining heir of King Alexander III. Her death sparked a succession crisis that would ultimately lead to the Wars of Scottish Independence. Margaret had been betrothed to King Edward I's son, a marriage that was intended to bring peace between England and Scotland. In the autumn of 1290, she set sail from Norway to claim her Scottish crown, but as her ship neared the Orkney Islands, a fierce storm blew up, battering the vessel with high winds and towering waves. Already ill with seasickness, the young queen could not endure the rough crossing. She died on the ship, her body brought ashore on the bleak, wind-swept rocks of Orkney. News of Margaret's death spread slowly, hampered by the winter weather. It was not until the spring thaw that the full implications became clear. Without an heir, Scotland descended into a period of political turmoil and infighting known as the Great Cause. Rival claimants to the throne jockeyed for position, while King Edward I of England sought to assert his own authority over Scotland. The stage was set for the Wars of Scottish Independence, a conflict that would consume the nation for generations. The seeds of that conflict were planted in the depths of a bleak Scottish winter, when a young queen's untimely death plunged the nation into uncertainty. It is a poignant reminder of how the brutal winters of medieval Scotland could shape the course of history in profound and unexpected ways. As the crisis deepened, even the business of governance became difficult. The Scottish Parliament, known as the Estates, traditionally met in open-air sessions, often in the dead of winter. In the teeth of a howling gale, with snow swirling all around, the assembled lords and bishops would debate the great issues of the day, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Travel to these meetings was a slow and arduous process, with many delegates arriving weeks late or not at all. In 1318, King Robert the Bruce himself was nearly captured by the English when he became separated from his men during a winter storm. Forced to take shelter in a peasant's cottage, the king narrowly evaded detection by his enemies. These difficulties of travel and communication had a profound impact on the governance of medieval Scotland. The monarchy and nobility often struggled to project their power and authority beyond their immediate domains. In the far-flung reaches of the Highlands and Islands, local lords and clan chiefs held sway, their rule virtually unchallenged during the long winter months. The same was true for the administration of justice. Royal courts and circuit justices faced enormous challenges in carrying out their duties during the winter. Trials and legal proceedings were often delayed or postponed indefinitely, leaving disputes to fester and crimes to go unpunished. In a society where the concept of law and order was still fragile, the brutality of winter could undermine the very foundations of justice. Yet despite all these challenges, life in medieval Scotland went on. People adapted as best they could to the rigours of winter, finding ways to survive and even thrive in the face of incredible hardship. The very struggle against the elements bred a certain toughness and resilience in the Scottish character, a grim determination to endure no matter the cost. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the realm of warfare. The Scots were renowned as fierce and tenacious fighters, a reputation they had honed through centuries of conflict with their English neighbours to the south. The brutality of the Scottish winter only added to their prowess on the battlefield. In the depths of winter, when the ground was frozen solid and the rivers turned to ice, Scottish armies would launch daring raids into English territory. Moving swiftly over the snow-covered landscape, they would strike deep into enemy territory, burning and pillaging as they went. The English, weighed down by their heavy armour and baggage trains, could only watch helplessly as the Scots melted away into the icy mists. One of the most famous examples of this winter warfare occurred during the Wars of Scottish Independence. In the winter of 1307, King Robert the Bruce and his army were encamped in the Galloway Hills, hunted and harried by the English. Supplies were low, and many of Bruce's men were on the verge of starvation. But the king had a plan. Under cover of darkness, he led his men on a daring march across the frozen wasteland, covering miles of icy terrain in a single night. At dawn, they fell upon the English camp, catching the enemy completely by surprise. In the ensuing battle, the Scots won a resounding victory, crushing the English forces and cementing Bruce's reputation as a brilliant military leader. It was a victory won as much by the toughness and endurance of the Scots as by their skill at arms. In the face of incredible hardship, hunger, cold, and the constant threat of death, they had prevailed, their icy resolve stronger than any English steel. The winter, so often their greatest foe, had become their ally, a weapon to be wielded against their enemies. As the long winter nights closed in once more over Scotland, one could almost imagine the ghosts of those long-ago warriors still roaming the frozen hills and glens. Their icy breath upon the wind, their silent footsteps crunching through the snow, a reminder of the indomitable spirit that had carried the Scots through even the darkest and coldest of times. And as the last embers of the hearth fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls of croft and castle alike, the people of Scotland would huddle close, wrapping themselves in the warmth of family and kinship. They would tell the old stories of winter hardship and winter glory, passing them down from generation to generation like precious heirlooms. For in the end, it was these stories that sustained them through the long, brutal Scottish winters. stories of survival against impossible odds, of courage in the face of unimaginable adversity. Stories that reminded them, even in the darkest and coldest of times, of the unbreakable bond that held them together as a people. And so they would endure, as they always had, through the long winter nights and the howling storms. Theirs was a land forged in ice and snow, a people tempered by the unforgiving fury of the elements. And in that endurance, that stubborn refusal to yield, lay the true strength and resilience of the Scottish spirit, a spirit that would carry them through the winter and beyond into the promise of a brighter spring to come. As the long winter gradually loosened its grip on the Scottish landscape, the first tentative signs of spring began to emerge. The icy crust of the lochs and rivers would start to crack and thaw, the water flowing freely once more. In the forests and glens, the first green shoots of new growth would push their way up through the melting snow, heralding the return of life after the long, cold months of dormancy. For the people of medieval Scotland, the coming of spring was a time of renewal and celebration. They would emerge from their winter confinement, blinking in the unaccustomed sunlight, to take stock of the damage the cold months had wrought. Roofs would need to be repaired, fences mended, fields ploughed and sown anew. But there was joy in this work, a sense of purpose and revival after the long winter months. The sound of laughter would echo across the thawing land once more, as communities came together to share in the labours of the new season. The scent of freshly turned earth would mingle with the smoke of the bonfires, lit to celebrate the returning warmth and light. In the great hall of the castle, the winter tapestries would be taken down and stored away, replaced by fresh new hangings in the bright colours of spring. The heavy furs and woolen cloaks of winter would be put aside, exchanged for lighter garments of linen and silk. The nobles and courtiers would venture forth into the castle gardens, marvelling at the riot of colour as the first flowers of spring burst into bloom. They would stroll arm in arm along the gravelled paths, breathing in the sweet fragrance of the air, feeling the gentle warmth of the sun upon their faces. Yet even as they celebrated the return of spring, the people of Scotland knew that winter was never far away. It lurked just beyond the horizon, waiting to descend upon the land once more with its icy fury. The memory of those long, brutal months was seared into the very fabric of their being, a constant reminder of the harshness of life in this rugged northern land. And so they would savour the fleeting joys of spring all the more, knowing that they were hard-won and all too brief. They would store up the warmth and the light, the laughter and the love, like precious treasures to be hoarded against the dark days to come. For in the end, it was this cycle of the seasons, this endless dance of winter and spring, darkness and light, that defined life in medieval Scotland. It was a harsh and unforgiving existence, to be sure, but it was also one of great beauty and resilience, of a people forged in the crucible of adversity and tempered by the unrelenting march of time. And as the last of the winter snows melted away, as the land awakened to the promise of a new spring, the people of Scotland would look to the future with hope and determination. They had endured the worst that winter could throw at them, and they had emerged stronger for it. They were a people unbroken, unbowed, a people who would always find a way to survive and thrive, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. So let us leave them there, in that moment of renewal and rebirth, as the great wheel of the seasons turns once more. Let us remember the hardships they faced and the strength they showed in overcoming them. And let us carry with us always the enduring spirit of Scotland, a spirit forged in the depths of winter, but ever reaching towards the light of a brighter tomorrow. The cruelties of winter bred a hardiness and resilience into the Scottish people that became woven into the very fabric of their culture and identity. Like the tenacious thistles and hardy heather that coloured their landscape, Scots through the ages learned to endure, adapt and even thrive amidst the bleakest and most bitter conditions. This spirit was exemplified by William Wallace, the commoner turned guardian of Scotland, who led a ragtag army to improbable victories against the English. In the brutal winter of 1297, as snow blanketed the hillsides, Wallace and his men launched daring raids from the highlands, striking hard before vanishing like ghosts into the frozen terrain they knew so well. English supply lines withered in the cold, while the Scots subsisted on meagre rations and iron resolve. But Wallace's winter campaign exacted a heavy toll. Hundreds succumbed not to English arrows, but to the icy spectre of dysentery that scythed through the Scottish ranks. Even the indomitable Wallace was not unscathed, his imposing vigour diminished by sickness and frigid deprivation. It was a fate that befell so many commoners and kings alike during Scotland's long centuries of winter. Frostbite blackening extremities, pneumonia rattling lungs raw from wood smoke, empty bellies gnawing beneath threadbare plaids. The harsh winter of 1424 nearly claimed the life of King James I himself when he became separated from his hunting party and spent a harrowing night in the open, his only shelter a makeshift snow cave. James IV, who ruled during the waning decades of the 1400s, was luckier in his winter experiences. His lavish wedding celebrations to Margaret Tudor in 1503 unfolded against a fairy tale backdrop of glistening snowfall. Bonfires roared in the courtyards of Holyrood Palace as nobles in sumptuous furs danced and drank honeyed mead into the wee hours. But such wondrous winter delights were rare in medieval Scotland. More common was the quiet desperation of common folk, eking a meagre existence from the stingy, frozen soil. Their homes were dark, cramped, and poorly insulated. Single-room hovels, where entire families huddled together with their livestock for warmth. Windows were a luxury afforded only to the nobility. Most crofts had, at best, a few small, unglazed openings covered with a skin or shutter to keep out the cold. The central hearth provided the only light and heat, filling the space with choking smoke and feeble warmth that scarcely held the frost at bay. For most Scots, winter fare was as spare as their accommodations. They subsisted on a paltry diet of salted meats, coarse oat cakes, and the occasional boiled turnip or cabbage, eked out with whatever withered produce remained in their cellars. The scarcity of fresh food, combined with close quarters and poor sanitation, meant that winter was always stalked by the gaunt spectre of disease. Infants and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, their fragile constitutions ill-equipped for the onslaught of icy temperatures and gnawing hunger. It was not uncommon for a family to lose multiple children during a single hard winter. For the very poorest, even burying their dead proved a challenge when the ground lay frozen solid as iron beneath deep snowdrifts. Necessity being the mother of invention, the Scots found ingenious ways to stave off winter's ravages. They stuffed their crude shoes with straw or moss for insulation and wound long strips of woolen fabric around their legs to make an early form of thermal underwear. Sheepskins and even goatskins were stitched into warm, if odoriferous, winter outerwear. But the most prized winter garment was a cloak or plaid of the thickest, shaggiest wool, often large enough to double as a blanket. For many commoners, this single meagre piece of cloth represented their sole buffer against the lethal cold. Nobility fared better, swaddled in sumptuous furs and fine woolens, able to afford the luxury of multiple layers, and even the occasional hot bath. Certain religious holidays offered brief respite from the season's privations. Christmas and Hogmanay, the Scottish New Year, were occasions for feasting, storytelling, and revelry around the hearth, a rare chance for commoners to indulge in special treats like meat pies, sweetened bannocks, and a dram or two of whiskey to warm the belly and blur the sharp edges of a bleak winter night. But such comforts were fleeting, and winter festivities were often darkened by superstition. Scots were a deeply spiritual people. their Christian faith intertwined with older pagan beliefs. The long nights and peculiar quality of winter light played tricks on weary minds, conjuring phantom sightings of ghostly lights, child-snatching fairies, and malevolent spirits abroad on the icy wind. Omens and portents were scried in every curl of chimney smoke, every mirror-black puddle of ice. A dream of a white Christmas foretold a coming death, while a hogmanay bonfire that burned till dawn ensured prosperity in the year ahead. Bits of rowan and sprigs of holly were hung above lintels to ward off evil, and pockets were filled with iron nails as charms against the sickness-bringing fae. Perhaps the most infamous of these ill-starred winter superstitions came to a head during the coronation of King Charles I on a frigid February day in 1643, 1625. As he processed solemnly towards Holyrood Abbey, a great gust of wind whipped the crown from his head, sending it clattering across the flagstones. Many in the crowd muttered darkly of the ill omen, even as Charles laughed off the incident with aristocratic aplomb. But the superstitious Scots would have the last word a quarter century later, when Charles, having worn out his welcome with his rebellious northern subjects, lost both his crown and his head to the executioner's axe. It seemed the winter spirits had finally called in their debt, exacting a king's blood as recompense for a reign begun under their baleful auspices. Such were the grim realities and haunting fantasies that swirled through the minds of Scots during the dark months. With little else to occupy the long hours of confinement, people lost themselves in lamenting the losses of winters past and dreading the deprivations of the winter to come. Scarcely a family in Scotland did not have its own bleak winter tales to tell, each one a new verse in the same doleful song, of loved ones lost to the cold or carried off by sickness, of cruel frosts and deep snows that buried their world in a colourless shroud of suffering. It's little wonder the Scots poured so much of their creative energy into storytelling, music and poetry. In a land so haunted by winter, imagination was as vital for survival as any plaid or peat fire. Perhaps no one captured the singular melancholy of a Scottish winter better than the great poet Robert Burns, who penned such immortal lines as, "The wintry west extends his blast, and hail and rain does blaw, or the stormy north sends driving forth the blinding sleet and snore." Even hearing these words recited aloud is enough to send a sympathetic shiver down one's spine. With a few strokes of his pen, Burns could conjure the very essence of winter in all its bleak hostility, the relentless battering of icy gales, the sting of driving sleet, the smothering embrace of drifting snow. He captured, too, the sense of awe and raw terror that winter held for the Scots, its power to ravage their world and rule their lives as capricious as any king. Blow, blow, ye winds, with heavier gust, and freeze, thou bitter biting frost. Descend, ye chilly, smothering snows. Not all your rage, as now united, shows. More hard unkindness, unrelenting, vengeful malice, unrepenting, than heaven-illumined man on brother man bestows. In the teeth of such pitiless conditions, is it any wonder that winter seeped into the very marrow of the Scots, shaping their character as surely as it carved their landscape? Weathering winter required reserves of strength, resilience, and sheer bloody-mindedness that lesser peoples could scarcely comprehend, let alone muster. Year after year, century upon century, the Scots endured, even as the snows piled ever higher and the nights stretched ever longer. They sharpened their wit on winter's whetstone, poured their defiant spirit into poetry and song, and kindled the unquenchable fire of their faith to ward off the killing cold. Perhaps, in the end, it was this capacity to find light in the bleakest dark, to wrest beauty and meaning from the unremitting winter of their world, that stands as the Scots' most enduring legacy. Long after the last snowflake of the Little Ice Age melted into memory, the indelible imprint of those hard winter centuries can still be read in every weather-worn stone and wind-scoured face in Scotland. So the next time you find yourself shivering on a cold winter's night, spare a thought for those long-ago Scots who faced down the fury of a frozen age with little more than their plaids and their unbreakable spirit. Draw your blankets a little closer, stoke the fire, and dream of thistles and heather blooming defiantly amidst snowdrifts and ice, a fitting testament to the stubborn glory of a people shaped by winter's cruelest lessons. As the darkness of winter deepened across the snow-shrouded landscape of medieval Scotland, the meagre light and warmth of day was replaced by a penetrating, merciless cold. Icy winds knifed across the land, finding every crack and gap in timber and stone to leach away any hint of heat. Impoverished crofters huddled together with their livestock in cramped, smoky hovels, desperate for any respite from the killing chill. Even the thick stone walls of great castles and keeps provided scant protection against the fury of a Scottish winter. Nobles and servants alike shivered in vast, underheated halls, bundled in layer upon layer of wool and fur. Hot mulled wine and smoky peat fires offered the barest hedge against the deep, gnawing cold that seemed to saturate one's very bones. The harshness of winter tightly constrained the limits of everyday life. With roads and passes choked with snow, overland travel slowed to a crawl, and trade dwindled to a trickle. Warfare too ground to a sluggish halt. No army could provision itself or maneuver effectively through such dire conditions. The basic exigencies of finding enough food and staying warm enough to survive became all-consuming struggles. A grim pall of cold, hunger and illness gripped the land, broken only by the occasional lavish Christmas feast or hogmanay celebration in some great lord's hall. The interminable darkness and brutal conditions frayed nerves and eroded hope. Scots took what meagre solace they could in drink, prayer, and grim determination, ever eyeing the shortening nights for any hint of winter's merciful end. Surviving a brutal Scottish winter was an arduous trial to be endured, year after year, generation after generation. It shaped the very character of the Scots, their resilience, hardiness, faith, and fatalism. To understand how they lived, fought, worshipped, and died, we must first understand the hardships they faced each winter. Only then can we begin to see how these annual ordeals made them who they were. The roots of Scotland's harsh winter climate can be found in its northerly location and rugged geography. Situated between 54 and 59 degrees north latitude, Scotland lies in the path of frigid Arctic gales and is battered by fierce North Atlantic storms. Much of the land is dominated by the craggy, windswept highlands, where icy blasts race down from snow-capped peaks with unrelenting ferocity. Even the lower-lying Midland Valley and southern uplands offer scant respite from the punishing conditions. Here, cold, dense air pools in ice fog-shrouded valleys, and frost lies heavy on barren moors. Rivers and lochs skin over with ice, while the surrounding hills lie deep and drifted in snow. The weak winter sun, when not obscured by leaden storm clouds, seems wan and feeble, unable to dispel the deep, penetrating chill. This foreboding climate was rendered even harsher during the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that reached its nadir in Scotland from the 15th through 17th centuries. Caused by a combination of reduced solar output, heightened volcanic activity, and shifts in ocean circulation, this prolonged cold snap plunged Scotland into a deeper winter freeze. Icy gales roaring down from the Greenland coast brought recurring crop failures, widespread famine, and frequent deadly cold snaps. The winters of the Little Ice Age were longer, harsher, and more unpredictable than those that came before or after, sorely testing the limits of Scottish endurance. One of the worst winters on record was 1434, a season so cold that the River Tay froze solid, and the ports of Inverness and Aberdeen lay icebound for months. The back of the bitter cold was finally broken in late March by a great westerly gale, accompanied by a rapid thaw. The resultant flooding of snowmelt and broken river ice swept away bridges, mills, and entire villages, compounding the winter's toll of misery, starvation, and death. Against the backdrop of such a pitiless climate, daily life in medieval Scotland became a grim campaign for survival each winter. The primary imperative was keeping warm, a challenging feat for commoner and noble alike. The stone walls of huts, halls, and castles were cold and damp, providing little insulation. Windows, where they existed, were small and unglazed, shuttered against the cold with oiled hides or thin panes of horn. Moisture-laden air inside would condense on the frigid walls and run down in rivulets, and the damp chill seemed to seep into the very stones. Carpets of sweet-scented rushes laid on floors would quickly become a sodden, reeking mess that only contributed to the pervasive cold and damp. The primary source of heat was a central open hearth over which a cauldron of porridge or stew might bubble. The flickering light of the fire provided scant illumination, and what little heat it offered was quickly sucked up the smoke hole or chimney. Acrid, eye-watering peat smoke choked the air, leaving everything coated in a fine layer of soot. The fire in the great hall of a castle might be kept burning day and night, but the feeble heat scarcely reached the shadowed corners of the room. Poorer Scots had even more meagre resources to fend off the biting cold. Most crofters shared their huts with their livestock in winter, relying on the body heat of cattle and sheep to help warm their cramped living space. The reek of manure and unwashed bodies combined with rancid wood smoke to create a noxious fug, but it was preferable to freezing to death. Other folk measures to keep warm included placing heated stones in beds to warm them, using canopies or curtains around beds to trap precious body heat, and simply bundling up in as many layers of coarse woolen clothing as possible. Even King James III of Scotland was said to have nearly frozen to death in his bedchamber during the bitter winter of 1424. So inadequate were the heating arrangements of even the grandest Scottish castles. Obtaining enough food to last the winter was another consuming preoccupation. Oats, barley, and rye could be dried and stored, and root vegetables like turnips could sometimes be dug out from under the frost. Meat was a scarcer commodity. Fresh game was hard to come by, so salted or smoked fish and meat had to suffice, along with precious stores of hard cheese. Even for nobles, the winter diet was monotonous and uninspiring, heavy on boiled grains and preserved meats. The humblest Scots subsisted on a thin gruel of oats and water, perhaps flavoured with a few shriveled turnips, or a scrap of saltfish if they were lucky. Malnutrition and a near-starvation diet was the grim reality for many in the icy depths of a Scottish winter. The spectre of true winter famine was an ever-present threat, as the winter of 1439 gruesomely illustrated. That year, after a failed harvest and cruel winter, starving Scots were reduced to eating bark, roots, and even cannibalism to survive. Thousands perished from hunger and disease. Corpses lay strewn in the streets of Edinburgh and Glasgow, with none left living to bury them. It was said the feral howling of starving dogs was the only sound to pierce the grim winter silence in many a Scottish village that year. Other creatures also felt winter's sting. Red deer, driven down from the highlands by icy gales and deep snow, sheltered in the marginally less frigid lowlands, pouring through the frost to reach withered lichen and heather. Many perished anyway, providing much-needed sustenance for equally hungry wolves and foxes. Livestock, too, fell victim to the cold. It was not unusual for a crofter's meagre flock to be decimated over the winter months. At least in winter, cattle were kept confined indoors, requiring less fodder than if they were allowed to roam. Emaciated, shivering cattle were packed together in foul-smelling byres adjacent to their owners' huts, where the fetid heat from their bodies helped keep both man and beast alive. It was a loathsome but necessary arrangement. Sheep fared little better, even with their woolly fleeces to protect them from the biting wind. Many a shepherd would find frozen carcasses in the lee of a snowdrift come spring thaw. With so much effort required simply to keep warm and fed, other activities were forcibly curtailed during the frigid months. Among the nobility, matters of governance, diplomacy and trade slowed to a trickle as winter storms and impassable roads made communication and travel an arduous ordeal. Royal courts and noble households withdrew into a state of semi-hibernation, hunkered against the elements behind the massive walls of Scotland's great castles and keeps. Here, the business of statecraft continued at a more languid pace, in front of roaring fires, over goblets of mulled wine and sparse winter feasts. Ordinary folk fared far worse in winter, as did the very governance of the land. With the roads choked by deep snow, it could become nigh impossible for royal officials, tax collectors, sheriffs or judges to make their appointed rounds. The processes of law and administration slowed to a crawl in the depths of winter. Many a crime went unpunished until spring, and justice delayed was often justice denied. The mustering of troops and collection of men and resources for warfare was another near impossibility in winter. An army simply could not march, maneuver, or provision itself in such bitter cold and deep snow as the English were to learn to their great cost at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Even Edward I, the mighty Longshanks, was loath to launch Scottish campaigns in winter if he could avoid it. The one exception was his brutal winter siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, a desperate gambit born more of fury and frustration than sound military strategy. Though Edward eventually triumphed after 4 long months, it was a Pyrrhic victory won at a terrible cost in misery and suffering for besieger and besieged alike. For common folk and poor crofters, the isolation imposed by winter weather could be the cruelest privation of all. With roads impassable and wolves prowling the icy forests, a Scots village could be completely cut off from the outside world for months at a time. Funeral rites and comfort for the sick and dying were frequently forgone, as priests could not make their rounds. Babies would be born, and the elderly pass with no rites observed. The stifling boredom and unrelenting sameness of those snowbound days could numb the mind and trouble the spirit. Is it any wonder then that Scots so eagerly embraced the winter festivities of Christmas and Hogmanay when they finally arrived? The celebrations may have been meagre by modern standards, perhaps a slaughtered pig, a hodgepodge of preserved autumn fruits and vegetables, and some precious handmade gifts. But they were a vital chance for light, warmth, revelry, and human connection in the face of winter's icy grip. Religion offered what succour it could, with Christmas and Candlemas providing rare bright spots in the winter gloom. But the church could do little to alleviate the season's physical hardships. Draughty stone kirks with their glassed-in windows were scarcely less frigid than the ice-rutted roads leading to their doors. Faithful Scots shivered their way through services, sustained more by their faith than any creature comforts. Even the great abbeys and priories were hard-pressed to feed and shelter the cold, hungry and sick who came seeking solace. Monks and nuns did their best to provide alms and care for the winter needy with dwindling food stores and scant medicinal knowledge. For in winter, sickness and death stalked the land, riding on the back of hunger and cold. Respiratory ailments were depressingly common, as dank living conditions and constant wood smoke exposure took their toll on lungs young and old. Pneumonia in particular cut a grim swath through the elderly and infirm each winter. With a very rudimentary understanding of medicine and disease, Scottish healers could do little to stem winter's tide of illness. They placed their faith in prayer, traditional herb craft, and a touch of superstition. It was commonly believed that malevolent winter spirits or vengeful ghosts were the true source of disease. Thus, folk preventatives often took the form of charms, offerings, or rituals meant to appease the unseen forces of winter. One devastating killer that seemed to wait for winter's deepest chill was dysentery, a disease that ravaged bowels and claimed lives with brutal efficiency. Likely spread by contaminated water and poor sanitation, the bloody flux scythed through Scotland's huddled winter populace year after year. No class of society was spared its lethal touch. In 1336, during Scotland's long war with England, an outbreak of winter dysentery killed over 4,000 soldiers of William Wallace's army in the space of a few weeks, crippling his ability to resist the spring invasion of Edward III. The winter sickness, as it was sometimes known, respected neither wealth, status, nor piety in choosing its victims. Beyond dysentery, winter's long, dark months provided ample breeding ground for fear, superstition, and all manner of irrational beliefs. Deprived of light, warmth, occupation, and human contact, the lonely Scots mind could conjure all sorts of disturbing visions. Old legends of vengeful winter fairies, icy kelpies lurking in frozen lochs, and ghostly wild hunts racing across the night sky took on new potency. Folk memories of pagan winter gods demanding sacrifice were not easily forgotten, and indeed found expression in crossover figures like the Cailleach Bure, the blue-faced winter crone who froze the ground with her staff. The interminable darkness seemed to embolden witches, demons, and practitioners of the occult. It's telling that accusations of witchcraft tended to peak in winter months, as desperation, deprivation, and fear worked to fray the bonds of reason and goodwill. Yet even the dourest Scots could find some joy in the festivities of a Scottish winter. Christmas itself was a fairly muted affair in the medieval period, not the great feast of later tradition. But Twelfth Night and Hogmanay offered opportunities for modest celebration and welcome distraction from winter's grip. Humble folk customs like bonfires, torchlight processions, and first footing blended with grander elite celebrations at court and keep. For a few days, Scottish castles rang with the revelry of lively dances, music, bardic performances, and of course much eating and drinking. It was a chance to briefly forget winter's privations, to chase away the darkness with light, fellowship, and song. Some Scottish winter celebrations were grand affairs indeed, like the epic Christmas and Hogmanay feast thrown by James IV and his new Queen Margaret Tudor in 1503. The newlyweds hosted a sumptuous, days-long extravaganza of feasting, music, masks, and tournaments at Holyrood and Edinburgh Castle. Wine, ale, and whiskey flowed freely as Scotland's nobles engaged in conspicuous consumption on a lavish scale. Of course, the pomp and pageantry of such events stood in stark contrast to the brutal conditions just outside the castle walls. While royals and courtiers gorged themselves on the last of the autumn larders, the common folk shivered and starved, noses pressed to frosty panes as they watched their betters revel. It was a particularly bitter irony in a winter of dearth and death. Other Scottish winter celebrations could be said to have literally tempted fate. Take the doomed coronation of King Charles I on a frigid February day in 1625. Amidst swirling Edinburgh snows, the English monarch was crowned King of Scots, draped in heavy robes of state fringed with ermine. The ancient stone of Scone upon which he was enthroned was streaked with ice. Shivering courtiers looked on as the king took his solemn oath, breath steaming in the freezing air of Holyrood Abbey. The omens that day were not auspicious, a crown that slipped and perched awkwardly, a scepter that threatened to tumble from the numb fingers. Some said the new king looked more like an icicle than a living man, as he processed out of the abbey into the teeth of a howling gale. As history tells us, Charles's reign would be brief and troubled, riven by political and religious strife that would culminate in civil war, his own death by beheading, and Scotland's eventual loss of sovereignty. But on that frozen February morning, all of that tumult lay in an unimaginable future. The Scots had more immediate concerns, chief among them surviving another long, bleak winter in a frozen, unforgiving land. Perhaps the grimmest of Scotland's many winter ordeals was the harshest one of all, a season that combined the worst effects of brutal cold, famine, and disease. Scots of the time simply referred to it as the ill winter, but later chroniclers would call it the disaster winter of 1674. That fateful year, winter descended early and hard, like the icy fist of an angry god. Gales and blizzards lashed the land mercilessly, while temperatures plunged and stayed there, locking Scotland's rivers and ports in ice. The autumn harvest had been meagre, and supplies were already low when the unrelenting cold hit. The people turned to their prayers, but the heavens were silent, the skies leaden and ominous. Game animals. As we've seen, the unforgiving winters of medieval Scotland posed immense challenges for travel and trade. With snowbound roads and treacherous conditions, even short journeys could become perilous ordeals. Merchants and travellers alike risked life and limb to brave the elements. One poignant example is the ill-fated journey of Margaret, Maid of Norway, in the winter of 1290. As the young granddaughter of Alexander III and heir to the Scottish throne, 7-year-old Margaret set out from Norway to claim her inheritance after Alexander's death. However, her passage across the North Sea was beset by brutal winter storms. Tossed about on frigid waves, the child queen fell ill and died in the Orkney Islands before ever setting foot in Scotland. Margaret's untimely demise would have profound consequences, plunging Scotland into a succession crisis and series of devastating wars. The episode illustrates the perils of winter travel in an age before roads were regularly cleared or maintained. Even kings and queens were at the mercy of the season's wrath. Ordinary folk faced even greater hardship when forced to travel in winter. The sheer difficulty of keeping pathways open meant many lesser routes became totally impassable. Merchants' wagons would get mired in snowdrifts, while travellers on foot or horseback risked losing their way and freezing to death. Inns and way stations were few and far between, so voyagers often had to rely on the kindness of strangers or fend for themselves against the elements. This had a stifling effect on trade, as the flow of goods slowed to a trickle in the coldest months. Perishable items were almost impossible to transport, and even hardy wares like wool and timber could be waylaid for weeks waiting for roads to clear. The economic impact was keenly felt, especially in remote villages cut off from the wider world. Warfare, too, ground to a standstill in deep winter. Moving armies and siege engines through snow-choked landscapes was a logistical nightmare. Armies struggled to keep supply lines open as men and horses froze in their camps. The harsh conditions favoured defenders who could huddle behind stout walls with blazing hearths while besieging foes shivered in the open, slowly starving. We see this dynamic at play in the bitter winter siege of Stirling Castle in 1304. England's King Edward I, known as Longshanks for his imposing height, sought to crush Scottish resistance by capturing the vital stronghold. His army arrived in the teeth of winter and found the Scots grimly determined to outlast them. For 4 long months the siege dragged on, with the English pounding Stirling's walls with trebuchets and battering rams, while the Scots clung on in increasing privation. Food stocks dwindled and disease ran rampant in the close confines of the castle. By February, the desperate garrison was reduced to eating their horses and even rats and tallow. At last, with his own army ravaged by winter and on the brink of mutiny, Longshanks was forced to offer terms. The Scots surrendered the castle, but earned the grim satisfaction of having made the mighty English king pay dearly for his prize. Stirling would change hands several more times over the course of the Wars of Independence, a testament to its strategic importance and the intestinal fortitude of its defenders. As spring thaws made roads passable again, towns and villages emerged to take stock of winter's toll. Inevitably, some travellers were found frozen by the wayside. having lost their battle with the season's fury. Their poignant stories, passed down through generations, serve as a reminder of the mortal stakes at play each winter. With the resumption of trade and traffic came a grim accounting of the financial impact as well. Merchants' ledgers show dips in profits from lost or delayed merchandise. Tax rolls sometimes had to be adjusted to account for the season's disruptions. The Crown and Parliament often debated measures to improve roads and bridges in winter, but the sheer scale of the task defied easy solutions. Still, life went on as it always had. With the snow melted and roads cleared, people resumed their journeys for business or pleasure. Markets bustled, and the land reawakened. The great seasonal wheel kept turning, even as memories of winter's bitter trials lingered. In time, those memories would fade, lost in the bustle of summer activity, until the next snowfall began the cycle anew. For medieval Scots, this oscillation between the stillness of winter and the renewal of spring was a fact of life. Navigating winter's fury required hardiness, planning, and no small measure of luck. But they endured, as they always had, finding reserves of resilience to match the starkness of the season. As we come to see, winter was an inescapable fact of life in medieval Scotland. Its impact felt in every sphere of existence. From the humblest crofter to the royal court, the season's icy grip shaped the very fabric of society. And nowhere was that impact felt more keenly than in the realm of health and medicine, a topic we'll explore in depth as our journey continues. In the flickering half-light of a winter's dawn, a hacking cough echoes through the warren-like confines of a crofter's hovel. Beside a meagre peat fire, a child's fevered brow glistens with sweat. A mother murmurs soothing words and a prayer, knowing all too well the perils winter brings. For in this harsh season, even minor illness could quickly turn deadly. Medieval medicine, with its limited understanding of disease, often did more harm than good. The icy winds howled through the glens, rattling the thatched roofs and seeping through the cracks in the stone walls. Huddled around the meagre warmth of the hearth, the crofter's family shivered, their breath misting in the frigid air. This was the cruel reality of winter in medieval Scotland, a time of hardship, privation, and all too often, death. As the long night stretched on and the weak sun barely skimmed the horizon, the spectre of hunger loomed large. The crofter's meagre stores of salted meat and dried grains dwindled with each passing day. The livestock, too, suffered in the bitter cold. The scrawny cattle huddled together for warmth, their ribs protruding beneath shaggy coats. The sheep fared little better, many succumbing to the gnawing hunger and relentless chill. For the poor crofter and his kin, there was little respite from the misery of winter. Their rough woolen clothing provided scant protection against the icy gales, and the damp chill seemed to seep into their very bones. They slept huddled together on pallets of straw, sharing body heat and fitful dreams of warmer days. But even in the great stone castles of the nobility, winter's icy fingers found their way through the cracks and crevices. The great halls may have boasted roaring fires and rich tapestries, but the damp seeped through the walls and the draughts whistled through ill-fitting shutters. In the year 1424, King James I himself nearly succumbed to the cold. According to legend, the king was travelling through the Highlands when a sudden blizzard forced him to take shelter in a crude bothy. Ill prepared for the harsh conditions, James reportedly almost froze to death before his retainers managed to kindle a fire and warm him with their own cloaks and bodies. Such tales were all too common in medieval Scotland, where even the highest born were not immune to winter's cruelty. The Great Winter of 1434 was said to be one of the worst in living memory. The snow fell ceaselessly for weeks, blanketing the landscape in a suffocating white shroud. Travellers spoke of drifts as high as a man's head, of entire villages cut off and isolated by the relentless blizzards. Many perished that winter, their bodies not found until the spring thaw revealed them. frozen and contorted in the melting snow. For those who survived the worst of the cold, hunger was an ever-present spectre. With the fields frozen and barren, crops withered and died. Game was scarce, the deer and wild boar driven to shelter deep in the forests. Even the rivers and lochs offered little sustenance, their surfaces frozen over, the fish retreating to the depths. In the winter of 1439, famine stalked the land, leaving behind a grim trail of sunken-eyed corpses and deserted villages. The cruel irony was that in a land known for its abundance of sheep, wool was a precious commodity during the long winter months. The shivering poor wrapped themselves in threadbare cloaks and tattered plaids, their only shield against the biting winds. In the great halls and castles, the nobility fared somewhat better, with fur-lined cloaks and richly embroidered woolens. But even they could not fully escape the chill, huddling close to the great central hearths and warming their hands over glowing braziers. As the interminable nights stretched on, the flickering light of the hearth fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Families gathered close, seeking comfort in shared tales and songs. The old ones spoke of the pagan spirits that haunted the long nights, the Kaileach, the ancient crone who brought the snows, and the Yule cat, a monstrous feline who devoured those who had not earned a new piece of clothing for the winter solstice. Christianity may have held sway in the lands of Scotland, but the old superstitions died hard, especially during the dark of winter. One tale that still sends shivers down the spine speaks of the winter of 1590 and the fate of a wealthy merchant in Edinburgh. The man was known for his miserly ways and his cruelty to the poor. As the story goes, on a bitterly cold Hogmanay night, a group of beggars came to his door, pleading for alms in the name of the Blessed Virgin. The merchant, in a fit of anger, turned them away, shouting that he would rather see them freeze to death than part with a single coin. According to legend, as the beggars huddled, forgotten, in the snowy street, a terrible apparition appeared before the merchant. It was the Virgin Mary herself, her eyes full of righteous fury. She pointed a finger at the trembling man and spoke in a voice like cracking ice. "You who have shown no mercy will receive none in return." From that day forth, the merchant was stricken with an unholy chill that no fire could banish. He shivered and shook, his teeth rattling like dice in a cup, until finally he froze to death in his own bed, a rictus of terror etched upon his face. Such grim tales served as a reminder of the virtues of charity and compassion, especially during the bleak winter months. Those who had the means were expected to share what they could with the less fortunate. A warm cloak, a hot meal, a few coins pressed into a grateful palm. For in the face of winter's cruelty, the bonds of community were all that stood between survival and bitter, lonely death. As the calendar marched inexorably towards the solstice, the people of Scotland looked to the small comforts and rituals that helped to brighten the long nights. The great halls of the castles were decked with greenery, holly and ivy, pine boughs and mistletoe. Candles flickered in the windows, a beacon of warmth and light to guide weary travellers home. In the villages and towns, folk gathered around the blazing Yule logs, telling stories and singing the old songs of winter's magic and rebirth. For the children, there was the excitement of the Yule goat, a mischievous sprite who left small gifts and sweets in their stockings. In some households, a place was set at the table for the Yule goat, complete with a bowl of porridge and a nip of whiskey to warm his bones. It was said that if the goat was well pleased with his offerings, he would bring good luck and abundance to the household in the coming year. But even as the people of Scotland celebrated the turning of the year, the spectre of hunger and privation was never far away. In the winter of 1674, the disaster winter struck with a vengeance. Blizzards raged for weeks on end, burying entire villages under mountains of snow. The lochs and rivers froze solid, and the sea itself turned to a churning mass of ice floes. Crops failed, livestock perished, and famine stalked the land. In the great houses of the nobility, the larders grew bare and the fires burned low. In the hovels of the poor, entire families huddled together for warmth, their bellies hollow and their eyes sunken with despair. It was a winter out of nightmare, a season of suffering that seemed to stretch on forever. But even in the darkest depths of that terrible winter, there were glimmers of hope and resilience. Neighbours shared what little they had with those who had nothing. Monks and nuns opened their doors to the starving and the homeless, offering what meagre comfort they could. And in the great halls of the castles, the bards and minstrels spun tales of heroism and survival, reminding their listeners that even the longest, cruelest winter must eventually yield to the promise of spring. As the last of the Yule logs burned down to embers and the candles guttered in their sconces, the people of Scotland huddled close and dreamed of warmer days to come. They were a hardy folk, tempered by adversity, and forged in the crucible of winter's bitter embrace. And though the nights were long and the winds howled like the mournful cry of a banshee, they knew that they would endure, as they always had, drawing strength and courage from the bonds of family, faith, and community that sustained them through even the darkest of times. And so, as the listener drifts off to sleep, lulled by the soft crackle of the dying fire and the distant howl of the winter wind, they can take comfort in the knowledge that they too are part of that ancient tapestry of resilience and endurance. For just as the people of medieval Scotland survived the brutal winters of long ago, so too shall we weather the storms and challenges of our own lives, drawing strength from the tales of those who came before us and the unbreakable bonds that unite us all. As the great winter of 1434 finally released its icy grip on Scotland, the weary populace emerged from their frosted hovels to survey the damage. Icicles still clung stubbornly to the eaves of thatched roofs, while snowdrifts towered along the narrow, muddy lanes, snaking between crofts and castles alike. The thaw had begun, but winter's spectre still loomed heavy over the scarred landscape and battered people. Though spring's first green shoots heralded the slow return of life, the winter's toll could not be so easily forgotten or overcome. For the coming of spring did not mean the end of privation and hardship for the common folk of Scotland. Their meagre food stores had been depleted. Their beasts of burden lay stiff and frozen in barren fields. Planting had been delayed, and many had succumbed to the twin menaces of cold and hunger. As families picked through the detritus of winter like crows scavenging a battlefield, the grim reality sunk in. Surviving winter was merely the first hurdle in the ceaseless struggle that was medieval peasant life. The dark pall of winter lingered longest over the stately castles and manor houses of the nobility. Though their larders were better stocked and their hearths burned warmer, not even the highborn were fully shielded from the ravages of a brutal winter. Many a minor laird or knight had been brought to ruin, the coin and credit required to heat their halls and feed their retinues sapping already precarious finances. Some now faced the indignity of a planting season without serfs to till their fields, the peasants having perished from cold and starvation. Yet even in the face of such bleak circumstances, life in Scotland soldiered inexorably on. Smoke began to curl once more from sooty chimneys as crofters raked the ashes from their hearths. The patter of hammers and the scrape of saws rang out as homes were repaired, and the debris of winter cleared away. Gaunt, ragged peasants hitched themselves to ploughs in the absence of oxen, to churn the half-frozen earth for a meagre planting. The turning of the seasons waited for no man, and there was work to be done. Keeping fed and warm were the twin imperatives that consumed Scottish lives for the long winter months. The two were inextricably linked, for staying warm required prodigious reserves of calories that could scarcely be spared. Food scarcity was an omnipresent spectre from December through March, and no one was left untouched. The typical Scottish peasant diet was already a dismal affair, consisting mainly of oat porridge, barley bread, pottage stews of vegetables, and scant meat scraps, and the occasional bit of cheese or preserved fish for those fortunate enough to afford it. In winter, even these paltry comestibles became a precious luxury. Crops withered in the fields under deep snow, and the cold-slowed rivers offered up a mere trickle of fish. Cattle and sheep dropped in the drifts, leaving only the most valuable breeding stock and a few scrawny chickens shivering in sod-roofed byres. The autumn slaughter had provided some salted and smoked meat, but it never lasted long. Only the most well-provisioned noble houses managed to keep their trestle tables groaning with food throughout the dark months. Even then, the fare took on a certain dull monotony as cellars of roots and kegs of salted herring were slowly depleted. Fresh game was always welcome when the hunting proved favourable and the snow not too deep for a hawking party or a pack of hounds to traverse. The king himself was fond of organising grand hunts to while away the cold, dark hours and fill his belly besides. One winter feast at James IV's court was said to have featured a centrepiece of roast warhorse stuffed with a suckling pig, which was in turn stuffed with a chicken. The bird's cavity fairly overflowed with seasoned pork stuffing and chestnuts imported at great expense from the continent. Such culinary extravagance was beyond the wildest imagination of the populace at large, who subsisted on ever more meagre rations as the long winter wore on. For most Scots, winter fare was more grim sustenance than gustatory pleasure, food eaten with the single-minded purpose of stoking the internal fires against the biting cold. Flavours were sharp and strong to jolt the senses awake. Pungent whey cheeses, throat-searing nips of whiskey, bitter herbs steeped in boiling water, or astringent tea brewed from pine needles when true tea was too scarce. Oats were the lifeblood of Scotland, and a simmering kettle of parritch was the culinary hearth round which the family gathered. The oats were often cut with barley, rye, ground acorns, or whatever other stretching agents could be found, transforming the porridge from a thick, creamy dish to a thin, bitter gruel as the winter progressed and the oat barrel grew bare. The pottage pot was likewise a catch-all for whatever shriveled roots, withered greens, and scant animal offal could be had. Its burbling contents grew increasingly watery and insipid as the months wore on, until it was little more than a weak vegetable broth, with perhaps a scrap or two of salt cod, floating forlornly amid the limp, colourless leaves. Such unpalatable slop was all too often the only thing standing between Scottish families and the yawning abyss of starvation. With little seasoning to break the monotony, meals became a flavourless ordeal to be endured for survival's sake alone. Even salt, that most basic culinary essential, was used with an almost religious parsimony, carefully measured out and solemnly sprinkled as if it were fairy dust rather than common mineral. The very old and very young were always the first to succumb when the food ran low. Many an infant born in the heart of winter quietly slipped away after only a few days at its mother's barren breast. The aged, with their toothless gums and shrunken bellies, would simply stop taking food altogether, as if they knew the nourishment was better saved for the younger and stronger. They would drift off like wraiths in the night, expiring quietly so as not to burden their families with the trouble of an unnecessary burial in the frozen earth. For those who endured, winter was a waiting game, waiting for the snows to melt, waiting for the first green shoots to appear, waiting for newborn lambs to suckle and fatten, waiting for hens to resume their laying. Scots measured out their days like misers. Each sunset counted as a small victory against the oppressive dark and cold. They marked the weeks by the dwindling supplies in their larders and the notches they took in their belts as their flesh wasted away. Surviving to see another spring was a triumph to be celebrated with humble gratitude. The winter of 1623 had been particularly fierce, adding to the general climate of misery that had Scotland in its grip. Plague and famine had already been stalking the land for several years, the spectre of disease dogging the heels of scarcity in a brutal 1-2 punch that laid waste to whole villages. Political turmoil boiled beneath the surface as well, with the unpopular English King James VI and I doing much to alienate his northern subjects from London rule. It was against this backdrop of simmering discontent that the king decided to make a grand progress to Scotland to mark his northern kingdom's first visit since assuming the English throne 2 decades prior. His intention was to be crowned at Scone in full view of his Scottish subjects, thus reaffirming the ancient rights and customs that bound monarch and kingdom together. Unfortunately for James, his triumphant return kept being delayed by the persistent ill weather. The king's luckless entourage set out from London in a soggy spring deluge, the rains churning the roads into a morass of muck that bogged down wagons and sent horses slipping perilously. Crossing the River Tweed into Scotland, the party was met with a biblical plague of midges that descended on man and beast in a hellish biting cloud. The royal baggage train became mired again and again as it wound its way north, the clumsy conveyances proving ill-suited to the rough Highland tracks. By the time the royal party reached Edinburgh in late May, they were far behind schedule, their sumptuous clothing and furnishings woefully bedraggled. A lavish feast had been prepared to welcome the king, but the kitchens of Holyrood Palace struggled mightily to produce the necessary fare. The locks had not yet thawed enough for decent fishing, and game was scarce after the deprivations of winter. The humiliation of an inadequate royal table had the court in a sour mood. James did little to ingratiate himself to the suspicious Scottish lords who had gathered to pay homage. The king's mannered English ways were regarded as foppish, his polished courtly diction sounding to Scottish ears like pretentious dandyism. The late spring chill seemed to seep into the very bones of Edinburgh society, leaving the festivities feeling far more funereal than celebratory. The road to Scone was arduous, with James's ungainly procession once more brought to a standstill by boggy terrain and miring rains. The king's gilded carriage became stuck fast in the mud, necessitating an unceremonious disembarking into ankle-deep sludge to the ill-concealed amusement of his Scottish retainers. By the time the royal standard was raised over Scone Palace on a dreary June morning, James's triumphant arrival had become a dismal forced march. The coronation itself was marred by omens and mishaps from the start. A freak storm blew in, as James was about to set forth from his chambers, extinguishing the tapers that were meant to lead the procession. The king tripped on the hem of his crimson and ermine robe, almost tumbling headlong down the chapel steps. As James knelt to receive the crown, the kingdom's most sacred relic, the stone of Scone, cracked with a sickening sound that reverberated through the hushed cathedral. To the superstitious Scots, it was an unmistakable portent of doom, an omen that the bond between king and land had been irreparably sundered. The banquet that followed was a subdued affair, despite the liberal flow of claret and whiskey. The conversations were muted, the revelry forced, and the pipers seemed to strain to coax any mirth from their wheezing bags. Scotland had endured a bitter winter, and the Scots could sense in their bones that their king augured an even harsher season ahead. When James VI and I departed for London a scant 2 months after his ill-starred arrival, it was with a palpable sense of relief on both sides. Little could the king imagine that he would never lay eyes on his homeland again, and that his line would be violently ousted within a generation. For the Scots, there was simply grim resignation as they set about preparing for the hungry times ahead, the twin blights of winter and English rule hanging over them like a shroud. Scotland's harsh winters had bred a hardy and resilient people, a fact that was never more apparent than during the country's darkest hours. They endured the freezing gales, the deep snows, the gnawing hunger, and the aching cold, year after brutal year. They faced down invading armies, scheming noblemen, and disease-ridden cities, with the same stoic resolve. Scarcity and privation were woven into the very fabric of their lives, an omnipresent reality that left no room for weakness or self-pity. In many ways, it was Scotland's unforgiving climate that had forged its fierce national character. To survive a Scottish winter was to be tempered like a blade in the fire, heated and hammered and honed until all softness was burned away. What emerged was something sharp and flinty, a spirit that could cut through adversity like a dirk through flesh. It was a hardness born of necessity, but one that served the Scots well in the face of their many trials. As the flickering hearth fire burns low and the chill of a long winter's night creeps in, one can almost imagine the ghosts of Scotland's past gathering close. They are a grim and weathered lot, their faces lined with the hardships of a life lived on the edge of survival. Yet there is a quiet pride in their bearing, a sense of hard-won dignity that even the bitterest cold cannot touch. For these are the souls who endured, who faced down the fury of a Scottish winter and emerged unbowed. They are the ancestors whose blood and toil and tears watered the harsh soil of their homeland, whose stubborn refusal to yield in the face of adversity echoes down through the ages. In their huddled forms and haunted eyes, we see the true face of Scotland, a nation forged in the crucible of winter, a people tempered by the unrelenting storm. And as the last embers fade to ash and darkness descends, we are left with a profound sense of connection to this ancient land and its unconquerable spirit, a feeling that lingers long after sleep has claimed us. The Great Winter of 1434 was one of the harshest on record in Scotland. It began early, with heavy snows blanketing the countryside by November. Icy winds howled down from the highlands, cutting through even the thickest wool cloaks and freezing men to the bone. The temperatures plummeted and stayed frigid for months on end. Lakes and rivers turned to solid ice, as if the very lifeblood of the land had frozen still. Blizzards raged for days at a time, the swirling white so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Travel became all but impossible. Roads vanished beneath deep snowdrifts. Horses floundered in the drifts, their riders forced to lead them on foot. The few foolhardy enough to attempt journeys risked becoming lost, disoriented, buried in an anonymous snowy grave. Even the hardy Scots, so accustomed to hard winters, were driven to shelter, huddling around smoky peat fires in their crofts, or shivering in the chilly, draughty great halls of the castles. Food supplies dwindled as the winter dragged on. The harvest had been meagre that fall, the wheat and barley crops stunted by early frosts. Now, with trade at a standstill and no way to import grain, starvation crept through the land like a ravenous wolf. The cattle and sheep, unable to find grazing beneath the deep snow, grew thin and sickly. Many perished from the cold and lack of fodder. Their frozen carcasses dotted the white fields, slowly devoured by the hungry. Desperate crofters took to slaughtering their precious breeding stock just to fill their children's empty bellies for another day. The spectre of famine loomed large that brutal winter. In the cottages of the peasantry, skeletal families gnawed on salted hide and thin gruel, their pinched faces grey and lifeless. They say that in the highlands, the starving resorted to eating moss, bark, even the flesh of the fallen. Disease followed close on the heels of malnourishment. Weakened by hunger and chilled by the bitter cold, the people fell ill in droves, racked by fever, bloody flux, wrathful pneumonia. The old and the very young succumbed quietly in the night, their passing marked by naught but a thin plume of smoke from the pyre. But even in the castles and keeps of the nobility, the jaws of that vicious winter clamped down hard. The great log fires roaring in the hearths offered scant warmth against the frigid, howling draughts that knifed through every chink in the stone walls. The lords and ladies shivered beneath mountains of furs, huddling close in the one room of the keep where the heat battled the damp and cold. They slept fitfully in the flickering dimness. their uneasy dreams stalked by the groans of the frozen trees in the black woods beyond the walls. Wine turned to slush in goblets, and platters of congealed venison felt like icy stones, even when fresh from the kitchens. The nobility's larders were better stocked than the peasants'. Salted meat, hard cheese, and dried apples secreted away at the harvest. But even these dwindled as the unending winter stretched on, and the snows grew so deep that hunting parties could not ride out into the white wastes to replenish the stores. The animals of the forests perished in droves. Stags, boars, and hares all lost beneath the smothering snows, or pulled down by the hungry wolves, whose desperation drove them to reckless boldness. After the wildlife was gone, only the wailing of the wind and the dead emptiness remained beneath those skeletal, ice-rimed trees. The nobles' kennels and mews emptied as they were forced to slaughter their treasured hunting hounds and hawks for meat. One tale tells of a lady, Elspeth, the young daughter of Laird Mackenzie, who pined for the greens and golds of spring as she gazed listlessly from her chamber window upon the bleak, colourless wastes. They say she wasted away in her bed, too heartsick to eat what little the kitchens could provide, her face as pale as the death-white drifts below. She perished with the first snowdrops of spring clutched to her sunken breast. King James I himself tasted the cruelty of that winter when he embarked on a diplomatic voyage to the Highlands. His entourage became lost when a savage blizzard blew up, concealing the road and driving the horses to a stumbling halt. The whiteout was so impenetrable and the cold so fierce, the king might well have frozen to death had his frantic men not happened upon a poor crofter's hut. The humble abode was already filled with the starving family and their livestock, with scarcely room to turn around. But they hosted their unexpected royal guest as best they could. The king spent a miserable, smoky, flea-bitten night crammed in with the commoners, with a shaggy sheep as his pillow, and only a threadbare blanket and the heat of the beasts to ward off the killing cold. But he survived the night and was profoundly changed by the experience. From thenceforth, James dedicated himself to improving the lot of the common folk who endured such hardships every winter. The Great Winter of 1434 finally broke in late March, but spring was cold and sullen that year, the thaw gradual and grudging. The snow slowly relinquished its deathly grip on the land, revealing the extensive damage. Immense drifts burying broken cottages and barns, collapsed roofs, fallen trees, and the frozen, desiccated corpses of animals and men. Fields lay ruined, icy water drowning the crops that should have already begun to sprout. With barely any seed grain left after the starving months, and few hands left to plough the waterlogged earth, the planting was meagre and late. The summer proved cold and wet, with freak hailstorms battering the seedlings and rot spreading among the hay. The reduced harvest that fall left little to lay away for the coming winter, perpetuating the cycle of hardship and hunger. It's said that Scotland did not truly recover from the Great Winter for a generation. The trauma left its mark on the people, on the collective psyche of a nation defined by its unending battles with the elements. To this day, the Scots tell tales of that legendary winter around their hearths, whenever the wind howls and the peat burns low. It's a reminder of harder times and the resilience of their ancestors who endured them, a testament to the grit forged by the ice in Scottish blood. Even in modern times, with all our technology and comforts, a Scottish winter is nothing to take lightly. Savage gales still sweep in from the Atlantic, piling the snow in monstrous drifts against the high stone walls of ancient castles. The wind still moans through the lonely moors like a lost soul. And when an icy draught sneaks beneath the door to prickle the back of your neck, it carries the chill of centuries, the ghosts of winters long past. So as you lie warm and cozy in your bed, listening to the rattle of sleet against the window's pane and the distant sough of the wind, spare a thought for those long-ago Scots. Remember those who huddled together in the fragile shelter of their crofts and castles, watching the snow swirl beyond the wavering gold circle of the hearthlight. Those who fought through the killing cold and gnawing hunger of winters, like 1434. The years the icy fist of winter squeezed the very life from the land. And be grateful that such times lie in the distant past. Naught but the stuff of legend and the whispers of the winter wind. Life in medieval Scotland was certainly no winter idyll. The season was a foe to be vanquished anew each year through grit, perseverance, and no small amount of luck. The Scots of old had to be hard folk, as hard as the land they called home, their spirits nigh as unbreakable as the ice that shackled their world. They left a legacy of strength and resilience that endures to this day. Even now, a glimmer of that old Scottish fortitude surfaces whenever the mercury plunges and the first fat snowflakes dance on the wind. As the cold comes down and the night draws in, you can feel it stirring in the soul, an ancestral spark, a stubborn ember that no winter gale can ever quite blow out. It's the blood of the Highlands, of the crofters and the kings, of all those who came before. And it whispers that no matter how brutal the winter, spring always comes again. The snow will melt, the grass will grow, and the Scottish spirit, forged in ice, will endure forevermore. And so we leave those long-ago medieval Scots to their well-earned rest, nestled deep beneath the piled velvet of the snow. The old stones of their castles still stand watch in these hills, frosted with moonlight and wreathed in silence. The locks lie still as glass reflecting the stars, smooth and flawless as a frozen tear on winter's cheek. All is peaceful, all is calm. So let the poetic whispers of history lull you into sweet slumber. Let your dreams wander those snow-muffled moors where the ghosts of valiant Scotsmen yet ride out on the moaning wind, and sleep deep and warm, knowing that the morning will dawn bright and clear, and that no winter lasts forever, not even in Scotland, the land where winter reigns as king. As the bitter chill of winter descends upon the Scottish landscape, we can only imagine the immense challenges faced by those who called this rugged land home centuries ago. For the medieval Scots, the hardships of winter were as much a part of life as the rain-soaked moors and mist-shrouded glens that surrounded them. In those days, before modern conveniences, a Scottish winter was a time of struggle and survival, when the very elements seemed to conspire against both lord and commoner alike. The icy winds howled down from the Highlands, bringing with them driving snow and sleet that could penetrate even the thickest wool plaid. Fingers grew numb and cheeks ruddy as people huddled close to smoky peat fires, seeking respite from the bone-deep cold. But why exactly were winters so brutal in medieval Scotland? To understand, we must first look to the land itself. This is a country situated far to the north, at the same latitude as parts of Norway and Alaska. Scotland's northern reaches lie closer to the Arctic Circle than to London, and its climate is accordingly harsh and unforgiving. Much of Scotland consists of mountainous terrain, with the Highlands covering the northern and western parts of the country. These ancient hills and glens create a natural barrier against the moderating influence of the Gulf Stream, allowing Arctic air masses to plunge southward over the land. The result is a climate considerably colder and wetter than other regions at similar latitudes, such as Denmark or Lithuania. This geographical reality alone would be enough to make Scottish winters formidable. But in the Middle Ages, an even greater climatic challenge arose that would test the endurance of Scotland's people for generations: the Little Ice Age. Beginning around the early 14th century, a period of global cooling began that would last for hundreds of years. Temperatures dropped precipitously, especially in Northern Europe and the British Isles. Winters grew longer, deeper, and more bitterly cold, while summers became shorter and wetter. Crop failures, famines, and disease outbreaks became more common as growing seasons shortened and food supplies dwindled. In Scotland, the effects of the Little Ice Age were particularly severe. Average temperatures plummeted by an estimated 2 degrees Celsius. The snow line crept lower down the mountains, at times nearly reaching the sea. Lochs and rivers froze over regularly, sometimes remaining solid for months on end. One contemporary account describes the winter of 1434 as being so harsh that most part of the country was covered with snow and many died from exposure. It's difficult for us to imagine today just how challenging daily life would have been for medieval Scots in the face of such relentless cold. With none of the insulated homes, central heating, or thermal clothing that we take for granted, their survival each winter was truly a triumph of human resilience. For commoners, home was often a drafty stone cottage or even a crude turf-walled hovel, ill-suited to fending off the chill. Firewood was a precious commodity, and peat fires provided more smoke than heat. Livestock were brought indoors to share body heat, adding to the close and unsanitary conditions. Nobles fared somewhat better in grand castles and manor houses, but even thick stone walls could only do so much against the penetrating damp and cold. Keeping fed was an ever-present struggle in winter as well. With crops dead and livestock succumbing to the elements, people relied on stored grains, salted meats, and hardy winter vegetables to ward off starvation. Even then, food supplies often ran low as the long winter months dragged on. The winter famine of 1439 was particularly harrowing, leaving many Scots dead from hunger and cold. In the face of such hardships, mere survival required full measures of tenacity and ingenuity. Heavy woolen plaids, fur-lined boots, and knitted cowls became essential garments. People slept huddled together for warmth, at times even bringing livestock into bed with them. Hot, mulled wine and whiskey were quaffed in abundance to stoke inner fires against the chill. But the impacts of Scotland's brutal winters extended far beyond the walls of home and hearth. In a land where even summer travel was arduous, winter could isolate entire communities for months when snow-choked roads became impassable. Trade slowed to a trickle, communications faltered, and the machinations of governance ground to a halt. Armies struggled to campaign as William Wallace learned to his dismay when winter dysentery decimated his forces. Even the best-laid winter plans of kings could be disrupted, sometimes with far-reaching consequences. When King James I found himself stranded by a blizzard on the road to Edinburgh in 1424, he was set upon by rebellious nobles and very nearly perished from exposure before reaching safety. It's said the experience left him with a lifelong hatred of the cold. As the Middle Ages progressed, Scotland's winter woes only seemed to multiply. The 1540s brought a string of miserably cold winters that led to widespread crop failures and famines. The year 1565 saw Mary, Queen of Scots, endure a grueling winter march from Edinburgh to Dunbar through knee-deep snow with enemies in close pursuit. And the winter of 1620 was so frigid that starving Scots were reduced to eating horses, dogs, cats, and other unclean beasts, according to one aghast English observer. Through it all, the hardy Scots endured as they always had, with a toughness bred in the bone from centuries of struggling against the elements. Winter might batter their country and upend the best-laid plans of even kings and queens, but it could never fully conquer the indomitable Scottish spirit. Indeed, it's possible that Scotland's brutal winters even helped to shape the very nature of its people. In a land where survival was never guaranteed and communal cooperation against the elements was essential, there was little room for fair-weather friends. The hardiness, loyalty, resilience, and wry humour so often associated with the Scots may well have been forged in the crucible of countless long, bleak winters. That's not to say Scotland's medieval residents simply resigned themselves to the miseries of winter. On the contrary, they did their utmost to keep seasonal spirits high, even in the bleakest depths of the cold. The winter holidays of Christmas and Hogmanay were celebrated with gusto, offering welcome respite from the daily grind of survival. Precious stores of food and drink were broken out and shared freely, while music, dancing, and storytelling around hearthside fires helped keep the long nights at bay. But even these fleeting moments of levity were often touched by the ever-present spectre of winter hardship. In 1434, during a particularly boisterous Hogmanay feast at Edinburgh Castle, the Great Hall's overloaded floor actually collapsed, sending scores of revellers plummeting into the cellars below. Miraculously, none were seriously injured, leading many to attribute their good fortune to the cushioning effect of the prodigious snowdrifts piled outside the walls. Through it all, the greatest bulwark against the ravages of winter may well have been the deep sense of faith and community that sustained the Scots through even the darkest, coldest nights. In a world where comfort was scarce and survival uncertain, people clung fiercely to their kin, their neighbours, and their God. The flickering light of hearth and altar were often all that stood between them and the howling void of the winter night. So perhaps it's no surprise that Scotland's brutal winters figure so prominently in many pivotal moments of the country's history. It was during the Great Winter Siege of Stirling Castle in 1304 that Edward I of England earned his moniker Longshanks, as he stubbornly refused to yield to the bitter cold or Scottish defenders. The ferocious winter gales that whipped the Firth of Forth in 1503 couldn't dampen the lavish celebrations of James IV's marriage to Margaret Tudor, which would ultimately give rise to the Stuart dynasty. And when the unfortunate Charles I opted to hold his Scottish coronation in blustery Edinburgh at the height of the fierce winter of 1625, the blizzards and icy gales seemed to foreshadow the stormy road ahead. Just a few decades later, his reign would end on the executioner's block, setting the stage for a period of upheaval that would reshape Scotland and England forever. Through it all, year after year and generation after generation, the implacable cycle of the seasons rolled on. And always there was winter, steadfast and unrelenting, a crucible that tested the mettle of Scots great and common alike. To survive it once was an accomplishment to crow about. To survive it as a people, emerging with a cultural legacy of resilience and fortitude that endures to this day, that is a feat worthy of legend. And so we come back to where we started, considering the long winter nights of medieval Scotland from the vantage point of our cosy modern world. As the chill wind rattles the window panes and the radiator kicks on with a comforting click, it's hard not to marvel at the tenacity of those long-ago Scots who faced down the fury of winter year after year with little more than a prayer and a stout heart. Would we today be made of such stern stuff? It's a humbling question to ponder as we sit surrounded by the warmth and plenty of the 21st century. But perhaps, in some small way, the echoes of those hard Scottish winters still linger in the cultural DNA of their descendants, a hidden reserve of grit and resilience bequeathed by ancestors who not only endured the worst of winter, but prevailed over it. So as we drift off to sleep, safe and snug against the cold, let us spare a thought for the ghosts of winters past, for the medieval Scots who huddled together against the howling night, drawing strength from faith, family, and an undaunted spirit that even the fiercest winter gales could never fully extinguish. Theirs is a legacy of tenacity in the face of adversity that still speaks to us across the centuries. A reminder that even in the darkest depths of winter, the unquenchable flame of human endurance burns on. The clock ticks softly, the blankets are warm, and the long night stretches out before us. Outside, a stray gust of wind whips a flurry of snowflakes past the window, glittering faintly in the moonlight. It's a scene that would have been all too familiar to those long-ago Scots, hunkered down against the cold, and waiting for the first light of a distant spring. But for now, the night is still and peaceful, the stuff of quiet dreams and drowsy pondering. What stories might the winter winds whisper if we had ears to hear them? Tales of long ago lives lived and lost, of hardships faced and overcome, of laughter and tears echoing down through the ages. In the enchanted space between waking and dreams, it's almost possible to imagine them, the lords and ladies, the crofters and cotters, all those once beating hearts huddled against the eternal cold. And perhaps, as we finally slip into slumber, we can carry a little of their strength with us into our own dreams. For if there's one thing those medieval Scots knew well, it was how to weather life's winters, with courage, with compassion, and above all, with the knowledge that even the longest, coldest night must eventually give way to dawn. So sleep now, and dream of brighter days to come. The winter winds may howl and bite, but they hold no terror for us here, safe and warm in the shelter of our modern lives. Let the ghosts of winters past keep their silent vigil, while we turn our minds to gentler things. Spring will come again in its time, as it always has and always will. And when it does, we'll greet it with hearts made stronger by the memory of those who came before us, who endured the worst of winter's fury and emerged unbowed. Good night, and sleep well. The long night awaits, but we face it armed with the knowledge that winter, no matter how brutal, is always followed by the promise of new beginnings. Just like those hardy medieval Scots, we too shall weather the storm and emerge into the light of a brighter tomorrow. And when we do, we'll carry with us the unbreakable spirit of all those who came before, who faced the howling dark and dared to dream of spring. Let their courage be our lodestar, guiding us through this winter and all the winters to come. And so we bid goodnight to those long ago Scottish winters, secure in the knowledge that their lessons of resilience and hope will never truly fade, no matter how many centuries may pass. They are a part of us now, woven into the very fabric of who we are, a legacy of endurance that we carry forward into every new day and every new season. In the quiet stillness of the night, their voices whisper to us still, a reminder that even in the bleakest depths of winter, the human spirit endures. So let us draw strength from their example and face whatever challenges may come with the same unshakable resolve that saw them through so many hard Scottish winters. For in the end, it is not the severity of the storm that defines us, but the courage and compassion with which we meet it. And with that thought to warm us, let us drift off at last into gentle dreams, secure in the knowledge that come what may, we are the heirs of a proud and resilient people who knew how to weather life's winters with grace, grit, and an unquenchable spark of hope. May their memory be a blessing and a comfort to us all, now and always. Good night, and may your dreams be sweet. Winter's chill may linger for a time, but spring is always waiting just around the corner. And when it comes, we'll be ready to greet it with open arms, just like the brave and hardy Scots who came before us, who endured the worst of winter's fury and emerged all the stronger for it. Their legacy is ours now, a gift to carry forward into every new day and every new season. So sleep well, and know that you are part of a long and proud tradition of human resilience in the face of adversity. No matter how dark the night or how cold the wind, we are never truly alone, for we carry with us the strength and courage of all those who came before, who faced the winter head-on and emerged victorious. And with that comforting thought, let us bid a final good night to the long winter shadows. Tomorrow will dawn bright and clear, full of promise and possibility. And when it does, we'll be ready to face it with the same unshakable spirit that sustained our Scottish ancestors through so many hard winters. For we are their heirs, the keepers of their legacy, and in us, their memory lives on, as enduring as the turning of the seasons. Sleep now and dream of brighter days to come. Winter's reign is fleeting, but the human spirit is eternal. And as long as we hold fast to hope and to each other, no storm can ever truly defeat us. That is the lesson of those long ago Scottish winters, and it is a lesson we carry with us still, a light to guide us through even the darkest of nights. Good night, and may peace be with you until the morning comes. Life for commoners in medieval Scotland was a far cry from the relative comfort enjoyed by nobility. For the vast majority of Scots, eking out an existence was a daily struggle, and never more so than during the long, harsh months of winter. The typical home of a medieval Scottish peasant was a simple 1 or 2 room stone cottage, often with a thatch or turf roof. Called a butt and ben, these crude dwellings provided some shelter from the elements, but little in the way of comfort or warmth. The walls were thick and the windows small, designed more to keep out the cold than to let in light. The packed dirt floors were often damp and muddy. Inside these dark, smoky hovels, entire families would huddle together for warmth, along with whatever livestock they owned. Cattle, sheep, and goats were simply too valuable to be left outside in the brutal cold. Their milk, meat, and wool were essential for survival. And so man and beast lived side by side, the animal's body heat helping to raise the temperature slightly. But even with this, it was bitterly cold inside a peasant's croft during a Scottish winter. The central hearth provided the only source of heat as well as light for cooking and crafts. Precious firewood, or peat, was burned sparingly, as it had to be gathered by hand during warmer months. On especially frigid nights, red-hot stones from the fire would be placed in the straw ticks that served as beds. A pot of oats or stew would bubble slowly over the fire, serving as the main sustenance against winter's chill. Salt-preserved meat and fish, hard cheese and bread would round out the meagre diet. For most commoners, fresh vegetables and fruit were a distant memory by winter. When the blizzards howled and the drifts piled high, peasant families would have little choice but to wait it out, huddled together in their crude shelters. Venturing out meant risking frostbite or worse. Only when firewood or food ran critically low would someone brave the deep snow and biting winds to forage for winter's necessities. If a medieval Scottish peasant's home was cold and inhospitable in winter, a castle or manor house was a relative bastion of comfort. With their thick stone walls, ample fireplaces and rushed floors covered in carpets, the nobles' living quarters were downright cozy compared to the peasants' huts. Large fireplaces blazed continuously in the great halls of castles and manor houses, providing both heat and light. The nobility dined on carefully preserved delicacies and imported spices that helped stave off the monotony of the winter diet. Clad in the warmest woolens and furs, the elites could remain moderately comfortable even in the dead of winter. Tapestries on the walls and layers of furs and blankets on the beds helped retain precious warmth. However, even for nobles, the cold seeped in around the edges. Castles and manor homes were typically constructed more for defense than comfort. The large, drafty halls could never be heated evenly, and cold always lurked in distant corners. Still, compared to the unrelenting misery experienced by commoners, noble families considered themselves fortunate indeed. The disparity between noble and peasant in medieval Scotland was never more stark than in winter. While the wealthy had some buffer against winter's ravages, the poor endured winter as a brutal test of survival. Yet no matter their station, all medieval Scots marked the passing of winter with a sense of profound relief and a renewed appreciation for the relative warmth of spring. As brutal as the living conditions could be during winter in medieval Scotland, simply keeping warm enough to survive the frigid temperatures was an all-consuming challenge. With indoor heating technology rudimentary at best, Scots had to utilise every method at their disposal to ward off the bone-chilling cold that pervaded castle and cottage alike. Clothing was the first line of defence. The nobility had access to the warmest and finest garments. Think thick woolen cloaks, fur-lined gloves and caps, tall leather boots. But even the elites layered their clothing as much as possible in winter. Heavy linen shirts, extra petticoats and stockings. Even multiple cloaks would be donned to trap precious body heat. Commoners, of course, made do with much less. A peasant man's winter garb typically consisted of a coarse, undyed woolen tunic, ill-fitting trousers, and leather shoes stuffed with straw for insulation. A cloak or blanket served as an outer layer. Women wore long, heavy skirts and shawls. Children bundled up in whatever cast-off clothing could be spared. Animal skins and furs, rabbit, sheep, even dog or cat if times were truly desperate, supplemented meagre wardrobes. But even the thickest woolens couldn't fully combat the damp chill that settled into Scottish homes during the long winter months. The central hearth was the only source of warmth for most commoners, and it was a feeble one at that. The flickering light of the peat fire provided more psychological comfort than actual heat. Families would sleep as close to the smouldering embers as possible, often all piled together in one bed for warmth. The fortunate might have a rough woolen blanket or animal skin to share, but for most, the only buffer against the night's chill was body heat. On the most frigid nights, it was not uncommon for families to bring the livestock inside to sleep amongst them. The steamy breath of cattle and sheep helping to raise the temperature slightly. In castles and manor houses, the great hall hearth was kept perpetually ablaze throughout the winter. But even the largest fires could not warm the vast, draughty spaces evenly. Nobles would drape tapestries on the walls to help insulate against the cold, and hang thick woolen curtains around their beds to capture precious warmth. Hot stones, wrapped in cloth, were sometimes placed in the bed to warm it before retiring. Yet despite these attempts, the cold always found a way to seep in, chilling nobleman and peasant alike to the bone. There was simply no escaping it. Winter's icy fingers touched all. This bitter reality was brought home in a near-tragic fashion to King James I in the winter of 1424. James, newly returned from a long imprisonment in England, was travelling through the Highlands when a fierce blizzard descended. Separated from his retinue, the young king sought shelter in a crude peasant's bothy. The humble structure proved a poor refuge against the raging storm. As the night wore on, James began to succumb to the cold, his body shaking uncontrollably. The crofter and his family piled what meagre blankets and hides they possessed on the king, even lying on top of him to share their warmth. These actions of his subjects likely saved James from freezing to death. The king's close brush with the realities of winter, as his poorest subjects experienced it, left a deep impression. In later years, James was known for his concern for the welfare of commoners, a rarity amongst monarchs of the time. Perhaps recalling his own icy ordeal, the king worked to strengthen the social fabric of the realm, knowing that all his subjects, high and low, ultimately faced winter's cruelties together. As difficult as keeping warm was in a Scottish winter, simply feeding oneself and one's family could be an even greater challenge. The cold months were a time of scarcity, when fields lay barren and livestock perished, putting an enormous strain on already precarious food supplies. For commoners, winter fare was monotonous at best. The autumn slaughter provided some salted or smoked meat to be eked out over the long cold months. Oats, barley, and rye from the last harvest were ground into a coarse flour for bread and porridge. Cabbages, onions, and other root vegetables that could be stored in the damp earth provided some variance. Fish caught in the fall and dried or smoked supplemented the meagre diet. But as winter wore on, even these humble provisions began to run low. By late winter, many peasant families were subsisting on a pottage of oats and whatever vegetables were left, supplemented by what wild game could be caught. The The weakest livestock were slaughtered as a last resort, the tough meat providing a momentary respite from gnawing hunger. In castles and manor houses, the winter diet was more varied, but still presented challenges. Nobility had access to expensive spices and imported delicacies that helped break the tedium of winter fare. Game from extensive hunting preserves graced noble tables. Carefully preserved fruits, nuts, and cheeses added some colour to the plate. Yet even for the wealthiest Scots, winter brought a certain austerity to the table. The lack of fresh vegetables and limited variety took their toll, as did the ever-present threat of spoilage. Rotten meat and mouldy grain were an ever-present danger, even in the best-stocked larders. The winter of 1439 brought this precariousness home in a devastating fashion. That year, an unusually cold and wet growing season led to widespread crop failures across Scotland. When winter set in, many commoners found their meagre food stores woefully inadequate. As the cold months dragged on, famine began to stalk the land. Desperate peasants resorted to eating bark, roots, even grass in a futile attempt to fill their bellies. Disease followed close on hunger's heels, as weakened immune systems succumbed to the rampant spread of infection. The impact was staggering. It's estimated that 10 to 15% of the Scottish population perished in the Great Famine of 1439, with some areas seeing losses as high as 30%. The suffering fell disproportionately on the poor, who had few reserves to fall back on. But even the nobility felt the pinch, as scarcity drove food prices to astronomical levels. In the face of such unrelenting hunger, acts of generosity shone all the brighter. Chronicles tell of the Bishop of Dunblane opening the doors of his palace to feed the starving, of abbeys and monasteries becoming refuges for the destitute. These tales became enshrined in folklore as a reminder of the power of communal solidarity in the face of winter's cruelty. For commoner and noble alike in medieval Scotland, winter was a time of enforced austerity when the spectre of hunger was never far from the door. The cold months brought a grim calculus: how best to stretch meagre provisions to sustain life until spring's blessed arrival. It was a reckoning that none could escape, a stark reminder of the fine line between feast and famine, life and death in a Scottish winter. Through the flickering light of the great hall's fire, the faces of the assembled revellers glowed with the warm flush of good cheer. The scent of roasted meats and spiced wine filled the air, the swell of music and laughter rising to the rafters. For this one night at least, the bitter cold and gnawing hunger of a Scottish winter could be forgotten. The occasion was the Feast of Epiphany, or Twelfth Night, the traditional end of the Christmas season. For the noble household hosting the festivities, it was a chance to display their wealth and largesse, to provide a moment of respite and revelry in the dead of winter. No expense had been spared for the feast. The long trestle tables groaned under the weight of the victuals. Succulent roast venison, savoury meat pies, rich puddings studded with dried fruit and nuts. For the assembled guests, it was a bounty beyond imagining, a stark contrast to the dreary winter fare that was their usual lot. As the night wore on and the wine flowed, the great hall became a riot of colour and sound. Minstrels played spirited tunes on pipes and fiddles, while ladies and gentlemen danced intricate reels. Jesters and acrobats performed feats of daring, drawing gasps and cheers from the crowd. For a few precious hours, the cares of winter were banished, replaced by the glow of good company and cheer. But even amidst the revelry, reminders of winter's cruelty lurked. The great fire threw shadows on the walls, dancing like spectres in the flickering light. Beyond the hall's thick walls, the wind howled its mournful tune, the cold seeping in through cracks and crevices. And for the serving staff and peasants in attendance, the feast was a bittersweet reminder of the privations they faced. While the nobility dined on the finest delicacies, Their own bellies grumbled with hunger. The warmth of the great hall was a fleeting pleasure, soon to be replaced by the biting chill of their own humble abodes. Yet for this one night, such distinctions were forgotten, or at least set aside. The Feast of Epiphany was a time for all to come together, to share in the warmth of community and the joy of abundance, however fleeting. In the face of winter's long darkness, such moments of light were all the more precious. As the last notes of music faded away and the final embers guttered in the great hearth, the revelers bundled themselves against the cold and set out into the frosty night. The glow of the feast would sustain them through the long winter weeks to come, a memory of warmth and plenty to be cherished and savoured. For the nobles and peasants alike, the Feast of Epiphany served as a reminder that even in the depths of winter, joy and celebration could still flourish. The warmth of good food and good company could, for a time, chase away the chill and the darkness. In a Scottish winter, such moments were rare and all the more precious for it. The feast was over, but its spirit lingered, a beacon of hope and resilience in the face of winter's unrelenting grip. It was a testament to the enduring power of human connection, of the ability to find light and laughter, even in the darkest of times. And it was this spirit, more than anything, that would see the people of medieval Scotland through the long, bitter winters and beyond. For all the hardship and privation that winter brought to medieval Scotland, it was in the realm of health and medicine that its cruelties were perhaps most keenly felt. In a time before the understanding of germs and sanitation, the cold months were a breeding ground for disease and suffering. The medieval Scottish understanding of health was a curious blend of ancient lore, superstition, and rudimentary science. The humoral theory, which held that the body was governed by 4 fluids, or humours, was the prevailing medical wisdom of the day. Winter, with its cold and damp, was thought to bring an excess of phlegm, leading to respiratory ailments and melancholy. But the true culprits were the close quarters and unsanitary conditions in which most Scots lived during the winter months, with whole families huddled together in small, dank spaces, sharing air and sometimes even beds with livestock. Disease spread like wildfire. Respiratory infections were particularly common and deadly. In a time before antibiotics, a simple cold could quickly morph into pneumonia, pleurisy, or worse. The chronically undernourished and those weakened by other illnesses were particularly vulnerable, their immune systems unable to fight off the onslaught of infection. Other winter maladies included rheumatism and arthritis, exacerbated by the damp cold, and skin conditions like chilblains and frostbite. Burns were also common, as people huddled close to what meagre fires they could muster. And always, hunger gnawed at the belly, weakening the body and the spirit. The remedies available were woefully inadequate to the task. Herbs and potions, poultices and bloodletting, these were the tools of the medieval Scottish healer. While some, like honey and garlic, did have antimicrobial properties, most were based more on superstition than science. In 1326, the famed Scottish military leader, William Wallace, found himself facing an enemy even he could not outfight. A dysentery outbreak that swept through his camp in the dead of winter. The disease, which causes severe diarrhea and dehydration, spread rapidly in the close confines of the military encampment. Weakened by hunger and cold, Wallace's men fell ill by the dozens. The camp became a fetid breeding ground of misery, the stench of sickness and death hanging heavy in the frigid air. Without proper sanitation or medical care, there was little to be done but wait for the outbreak to run its grim course. By the time the epidemic had passed, Wallace's once mighty army had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Hundreds lay dead, their bodies hastily buried in the frozen ground. Those who survived were left weakened and demoralized, easy prey for the English forces they had been fighting. The outbreak was a brutal reminder of winter's indiscriminate cruelty, its ability to strike down even the strongest and most valiant. In a time before modern medicine, such epidemics were all too common, their toll measured in lives lost and futures forever altered. For commoner and noble alike, winter illness was a spectre that loomed large. It was a time of dread and uncertainty when even a minor ailment could quickly turn deadly. The home remedies and superstitions that passed for medicine were small comfort in the face of such pervasive suffering. Yet even in the depths of winter sickness, there were glimmers of hope and humanity. Neighbours cared for neighbours, sharing what meagre food and warmth they had. Monks and nuns tended to the sick and dying, offering what comfort they could. In the face of winter's bleak realities, such acts of compassion shone all the brighter. It was this spirit of resilience and solidarity that saw the people of medieval Scotland through the worst of winter's ravages. In a time of unrelenting hardship, they found strength. As the bitter winter winds howled through the crags and glens, life in medieval Scotland ground to a halt once more under the smothering weight of ice and snow. In an age before modern comforts and conveniences, the cold months meant a constant battle for survival, as much against the unforgiving elements as against hunger, illness and despair. Even the nobility, with their thick stone walls and grand feasting halls, were not immune to winter's icy grasp. The story of King James I's brush with death during the winter of 1424 is a chilling reminder of just how precarious life could be, even for those born to privilege and power. It was the dead of December, and James was travelling through the snow-cloaked Highlands on his way to Inverness Castle. As night fell, a ferocious blizzard blew in, obscuring the landscape in a blinding tempest of white. The king and his retinue lost their way in the whiteout conditions, wandering for hours through waist-deep snowdrifts as the temperature plummeted. By the time they finally stumbled upon a humble crofter's cottage, James was in dire straits, his hands and feet blackened with frostbite, his lips tinged blue, his mind delirious from hypothermia. The crofter and his family worked through the night to save their monarch, swaddling him in blankets beside a blazing peat fire, feeding him warm broth and ale, and slowly, painstakingly, coaxing him back from the brink. James would recover from his ordeal, though he lost a finger to frostbite and nursed a newfound respect for the dangers of winter. But for most of his subjects, the risk of freezing to death was a constant companion through the bleak months, with only the most meagre of defences to ward off the killing cold. Clothing offered what scant protection it could. Peasants bundled up in as many woolen layers as they could muster, tunics, hose, hoods, and cloaks if they were lucky enough to afford them. Animal furs and hides were prized for their warmth, though beyond the reach of most. The well-off might cluster around in fur-lined boots and gloves, but chilblains and frostbite remained facts of life for rich and poor alike. At home, the hearth formed the heart of winter survival, serving as the sole source of heat, light, and cooking in peasant cottages and grand halls alike. From its embers radiated what meagre warmth could be mustered against the clawing cold. Families would huddle as close to the fire as they could, sleeping together for shared body heat, sometimes even bringing in livestock to add to the warmth. Hot stones, heated in the ashes and wrapped in cloth, would be tucked into beds as a kind of primitive hot water bottle. Even still, frost would creep across the interior walls and rime the rushes strewn across the floors. Breath misted in the frigid air indoors as well as out. With the larders of summer and autumn exhausted, food became scarce as winter tightened its grip. Anything that could be was salted, dried or smoked in preparation. Meats, fish, vegetables, fruits. But supplies inevitably dwindled as the months wore on and the snows remained. Grains like oats and barley, milled and stretched into porridges and breads, formed the bulk of winter sustenance for most, augmented by whatever shriveled produce and preserved stocks remained. For many, each meal was a gamble between staving off starvation and depleting precious stores too soon, with no guarantee that spring would arrive in time to replenish them. The spectre of famine was never far, prowling at the edges of winter like a wolf at the door. The cruel winter of 1439 brought such desperate hunger that it was said some resorted to eating the dead, a macabre illustration of the lengths to which people would go when pushed to the harrowing brink between life and death. Scarcity took its toll, not just in empty bellies, but in vulnerability to disease as well. Malnutrition left the poor especially prone to illnesses like pneumonia, bronchitis, rheumatic fever, and the flux, all the more deadly in an age before antibiotics and modern medical care. The winter dysentery epidemic that scythed through William Wallace's army in 1304, killing hundreds, was a tragically common occurrence. With so many huddled together in damp, unsanitary conditions, disease could spread like wildfire, the very closeness necessary to fend off the cold now an ally to contagion. It's estimated that respiratory infections alone may have accounted for up to a third of winter deaths. Even if one managed to avoid fatal illness, winter's other dangers were legion. Frostbite could lead to lost fingers and toes or turn gangrenous. Smoke from constantly burning fires blackened lungs and stung eyes. The very old and very young were most at risk, but none were truly safe from winter's icy scythe. Childbirth in the cold months was an especially perilous endeavour in an age of primitive obstetrics. Infant mortality would often double or even triple compared to summer rates, as fragile newborn lives were snuffed out by frigid temperatures, illness, and a lack of proper nutrition for nursing mothers. For those who did survive winter's cruel gauntlet, the experience left its mark, both physically and psychologically. Archaeological examination of medieval Scottish remains reveals spines bent by hunching against the cold, joints gnarled by frostbite and arthritis, and lungs scarred by pneumonia and smoke. The effects of malnutrition can be read in the bones as well, with growth stunting, rickets, and other signs of deficiency. Surviving winter was an ordeal that bred a certain grim hardiness in the Scots, a stubborn fortitude against adversity that would come to define the national character, when the American poet Ralph Waldo Emerson later wrote that the Scots are the indomitableness of human beings against weather. He was paying backhanded homage to the tenacity required to endure the unyielding torment of those medieval winters, year after year, generation after generation. But endure they did, with a stubborn resolve born of necessity and sheer force of will. Winter was weathered with a certain fatalistic stoicism, an acceptance that the cold months were simply a cruel fact of life that had to be borne, like the changing of the seasons or the turning of the tides. That's not to say there weren't bright spots in the bleakness, flashes of light and levity amidst the privation and pain. The great winter festivals of Christmas and Hogmanay offered brief respite from the cold, occasions for feasting, carousing, and companionship that helped to fortify the spirit against the trials to come. Huddled together around smoky peat fires, warmed by whiskey and fellowship, the Scots would swap stories and songs, spinning tales of summer's promised return. Poets like Robert Henryson, in verses like The Winter Ballad, gave voice to the stubborn optimism that spring would one day conquer winter's icy tyranny. And thus bides winter with his frosty beard, till once again the spring her flowers has reared, and banished all the cold with her fair face. Even in the depths of winter's barrenness then, hope persisted, a small, faint thing, perhaps, but unquenchable still. Life went on, as it always had, and always would, in a hard-bitten cycle of resilience and dogged survival, and slowly but surely, the thaw would come. The first snowdrops would peek tentatively through the frost, heralding the longed-for return of gentler days. Icicles would drip from the eaves, and the land would soften and green beneath the strengthening sun. Winter, at long last, would loosen its white-knuckled grip, and the hardy Scots would emerge from their smoky hovels to take up plough and pasture once more. They would count their losses, bury their dead, and begin the grim work of rebuilding, in stoic certainty that winter would return again to ravage and reap. But for a precious few short months at least, some small measure of ease could be reclaimed. So as we close our eyes tonight, let us spare a moment to marvel at the tenacity of those Scots of old, who endured through centuries of merciless winters, with little more than grit and grim humour to sustain them. Theirs is a story of the very essence of the human will to survive in the face of the cruelest odds. And perhaps, as we drift off into the warm, safe comfort of our modern beds, we can allow ourselves a moment of gratitude as well. Gratitude for the countless small luxuries of heat and food and health that we so often take for granted. Luxuries that would have been all but unimaginable to our cold-scoured ancestors, huddled together in their darkened crofts, watching the winter winds howl and waiting for the thaw. Thank you so much for watching. I truly hope this has given you a new appreciation for the incredible resilience of the human spirit, as embodied by the story of those long ago Scottish winters. If this kind of soothing historical storytelling helps you relax and drift off to sleep, please do consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. I'm always so grateful for your support. Good night and sweet dreams.